Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs, here to wish you a happy holiday season. This time of year, we sometimes have a lot of free time, sitting in the bathroom, hiding from family arguing about politics, or dodging the kids' new Nerf guns. So, to help you cope with that quiet time, we've put together 2 hours and 55 minutes of Flight Numbers Don't Matter comparisons for you to enjoy. We hope you unwrapped some sweet disc golf gear and are all set for the 2026 season. Enjoy. Some advice that I've heard given to newer disc golfers more times than I can count is to throw slower discs, like putters and mid-ranges. And there's multiple reasons that's good advice. They're easier to control, more forgiving, and tend to teach better form. But one of the other reasons I hear is that when you're new, putters and mid-ranges will fly just as far as your drivers. In fact, that's advice that I have given myself. But is this actually true? Well, today we're going to try to find out, because we have 4 players of varying skill and power levels, from FA4 to MA4, MA2, and MPO, throwing discs from speed 1 to speed 13 to find out which one flies the farthest. Today's video is sponsored by Ideo Sports. More about the all-new Syncrasy Evo and Brawler in just a bit. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs, and this is Flight Numbers Don't Matter, where we conduct large-scale tests and comparisons of discs to see if these flight numbers are really all they're cracked up to be. And today we'll be focusing on just one flight number: speed. Many newer disc golfers believe that speed as a flight number just means this disc goes farther. But is that actually true? I've also heard speed described as the speed at which you have to throw a disc to get the right flight. For example, you can't throw an 8 speed as fast as a 13 speed because then the 8 speed will not fly as intended. Now is probably a good time to bring in an expert opinion. According to Innova, who invented flight numbers, speed is the rate at which a disc can travel through the air. Speed 14 distance drivers are the fastest, having the PDGA maximum legal wing width. They go on to say something that might give us a clue about our results later. High-speed discs are not recommended for beginners as they require more power to fly properly. But I'm not sure if that's always true. So let's talk about how today's test is going to work. We have 4 players of very different skill and power levels throwing today. Starting with Team Six Sided Discs' Caleb Thomas, he's going to be throwing for our MPO level today, pushing over 65 miles an hour or more on his backhand throws. I'll be throwing for MA2, which is where I would play if I played in a competitive sanctioned event. My backhands are probably right around 50 miles an hour, but I will also be testing my forehand today because I can definitely throw faster on forehand. My friend Josh here is going to be throwing for us at the MA4 or casual level today. And my wife Emily is throwing for FA4. Neither Josh nor Emily have actually competed in any sort of sanctioned tournament, so they're more like casual players, but if they were to play sanctioned, those are the divisions they would play in. 2 of our 4 throwers also have another thing in common, because my wife Emily and I are both throwing all of our shots today wearing the latest release from today's sponsor, Ideo Sports. Ideo is excited to announce the new Syncrasy Evo and High Top Brawlers are available now. The Syncrasy Evo is the next evolution in the only shoe designed for disc golf. With a slimmer profile for improved fit and feel, it also features a stronger drag-on toe cap and new ripstop material for enhanced durability and protection. I purchased a pair of Ideo Syncrasies last year and used them for several months before I reached out to Ideo to sponsor one of our videos. And I'm not only delighted to have them on board again, but I can also report that I still wear my first pair of Syncrasies, and they've lasted longer than any disc golf shoe I've tried to use before. Emily and I used their online sizing guide, and the fit and feel is fantastic. But the Syncrasy Evo is only half the story for Ideo now, because they also released their all-new high-top shoe, the Brawler. The Brawler features everything great about the Syncrasy, with the added ankle support of their new Adaptabrace. The Brawler comes with traditional laces, as well as their new quick lacing system that stores conveniently in the lace pocket on the side. I chose the Corey Ellis Brawlers in this beautiful black and purple galaxy design. The fit and feel is very similar to the Syncrasy Evo, and as someone who had surgery to repair a torn ligament in my ankle a couple of years ago, the added support is something I really appreciate as well. You can learn more about the Syncrasy Evo or Brawler at ideosports.com or at the link in the video description, and use code 6sided for free shipping on your order. Huge thanks to Ideo Sports for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's get back to the action. As I said earlier, we're going to be throwing 13 discs from speed 1 to 13. And we've selected all of those from Discraft because I think it was the only brand we actually had 13 discs, one in every speed to choose from. My intention with choosing all discs from a single brand was that it would reduce the number of variables. And as I discussed in my presentation at Disc South, comparing flight numbers, especially speed, from one brand to another is risky business. Now, if you're a Discraft fan, you might be thinking to yourself, wait, Discraft doesn't have a 1-speed, but technically they do, because this is a 2-speed Roach, and this is what they call a 2-speed Rattler. Rattler? And this is what they call a 2-speed Rattler. But I think if we're being honest, if this disc came out today, it would almost certainly be a 1-speed. Now, we also tried to choose relatively neutrally stable discs from Discraft's lineup. So moving up from the Rattler, we'll be throwing a Crystal Roach, Big Z Luna, Big Z Comet, Z Buzz SS, Z Zombie, Z Cicada, Z Swirl Mantis, and I'm sure you're all expecting the Undertaker for 9 speeds, but I couldn't get a hold of one. So the best thing we could get was a slightly beat-in Jawbreaker Raptor, a Z-Die Avenger SS, an ESP Scorch for our 11-speed, ESP Thrasher, and for our 13-speed, a Big Z Crank. Also, importantly, all of these discs are max weight. Now, we'll be throwing these discs multiple times in an open field. The goal is distance, not accuracy, so once each player has registered what they feel like is the maximum distance they can get with that disc, we'll enter it into our graph, which may look something like this. What we're hoping to see is a clear result, showing either for higher arm speeds, as disc speed increases, so does distance, and for lower arm speed, as disc speed increases, they reach a speed at which nothing faster goes farther. Let's begin with my wife Emily, who's representing FA4 and those beginner arm speeds. Now, she has a natural high sort of Anheuser release, and so the neutral stability on most of these discs gave them time to turn and then fight out for decent distance. And her results are pretty interesting. From speed 1 through 7, we see a mostly consistent increase in distance. The Rattler, Roach, and Luna all come in around 140 feet, but then the Buzz SS and Comet jump up into the high 180s, with the Zombie and Cicada pretty close to those mid-ranges. That distance improves again for the 8-speed Mantis and 9-speed Raptor, but it looks like Emily's distance kind of plateaus here. We're seeing decreases in distance with the 10-speed Avenger SS, the 11-speed Scorch, which is quite interesting because it does sort of support that idea that as the disc gets faster, it's harder for her to get a full and complete flight. However, she did register 203 feet with the Thrasher and 198 with the Crank, which are only a few feet off of her best distance of 206 feet with the Mantis. The overall trend on Emily's throws is increasing in average distance, and there's no question that the faster discs on average did travel farther. But I think we'll learn more when we get those distances and sort of compare them against the rest of our throwers. So let's move on to our MA4 thrower, Josh. Josh steps up and gets a great pull on the Rattler, Roach, and Luna, steadily increasing distance each time. And that trend for him continued with the Comet at 222 feet, the Buzz SS at 232 feet, and the Zombie at 255. But interestingly, the Cicada, Mantis, Raptor, and Avenger SS all come in shorter than the Zombie. Josh, though, saved the best for last because his top 3 distances were with the top 3 speeds. 277 feet with the Thrasher, 305 with the Crank, and 312 with the Scorch. And Josh's results here pretty clearly show the faster discs added distance, sort of directly contradicting this advice that most newer players or lower arm speeds get. But will this hold true for our other throwers? Only one way to find out. Yep, it's my turn now. I'll be representing the MA2 level, and I'll be throwing all of these discs on both backhand and forehand. And this does bring in another sort of variable, I guess, because most of these discs I wouldn't throw on forehand, so we'll see how it goes. First up, let's see my backhand, where I kick things off with 248 feet from the Rattler, 272 from the Roach, and 282 from the Luna. I continued increasing the distance with the Comet at 295, but fell off with the Buzz SS and Zombie around 270. I got that upward trend going again, though, with the Cicada at 325 feet. And then I was all over the place. As short as 269 with the Raptor, back over 300 with the Avenger SS and the Scorch. But again, interestingly, I registered my 2 best distances with the 2 fastest discs. 337 with the Thrasher, and 342 with the Crank. And this really surprised me because if you were to ask me what my farthest flying disc was, I would probably tell you it's my 10-speed Avenger SS, at least if we're talking about backhands. Looking at my results side by side with Josh's, they are pretty similar. There's a steady increase overall, even though there's a few dips here and there. But how will my forehand compare to my backhand? Well, let's just say things got off to a difficult start. The Rattler, Roach, and Luna aren't exactly what I would choose to throw on forehands, and I believe all 3 turned into rollers. And if you take a look at these results, the distances are well below my backhand numbers. That is, until we finally got to a disc that I could actually throw on forehand, the Zombie. The Zombie, along with the Avenger SS and Thrasher, actually got some decent flights on forehand. But the winner, by a long way, was the 7-speed Cicada, which crushed not only all the other discs I threw on forehand, but all my backhand throws as well, finishing with an impressive 363 feet, which leaves my 2 charts looking both very different, but also a bit similar. While there are huge outliers on the forehand chart, which is kind of what I expected, overall the drivers are clearly flying farther, though not necessarily exactly according to speed. The backhand chart also shows the drivers performing kind of as one might expect. So will any of this change for the fastest arm we have available, Team 6-Sided Discs, Caleb Thomas? Well, let's take a look at Caleb's throws one by one. Caleb put up some interesting numbers. He nearly got to 300 feet with the Rattler, which is crazy. The Rattler's like such a weird, slow disc. Pushed 357 with the Roach. That was really impressive. 315 with the Luna, and I think both he and I agreed it could have gone farther. The Comet at 339. Buzz SS at 360. Zombie at 376, and we're sort of consistently increasing distance here. But this is where we start to see things sort of plateau and bounce around a little bit. The Cicada put in 410, the Jawbreaker Raptor 376, the Avenger SS 375, the Crank 398, which left these 3 shots as Caleb's best distances, with the Scorch at 425, the Thrasher at 426, and surprisingly, the Mantis as his best distance at 460. Caleb put up some excellent numbers here. His distance is peaking in the fairway drivers rather than distance drivers, which is a bit surprising. So where do all these numbers leave us? Well, looking at these charts side by side, I have a lot of different thoughts. The first half of Josh's chart, my backhand, and Caleb's charts are all pretty similar, a steady increase for almost every disc. And the second half of Emily's, Caleb's chart, and mine also look similar, with big distance for the faster fairways and distance drivers. I think it's entirely possible we would see different results if we had used more overstable discs, where that arm speed has a much bigger effect on getting higher speed overstable discs to push out and get a full flight. So let us know if that's something you'd like to see in the future. But if we go back to the advice that new players get, that original statement was, putters and mid-ranges fly as far as drivers will. And our data shows that that is definitively false. Faster discs can fly faster. They have less wind resistance and therefore fly farther. However, there does appear to be the potential for diminishing returns. At a certain point, it's not about the speed of the disc, but rather throwing it with the right amount of power and angle to get the maximum flight possible. While distance drivers fly farther on average, there is still a very good reason why we give advice to throw putters in mid-ranges. On tighter fairways, while that extra 20 to 30 feet might be possible, you often need a lot more airspace to get that distance. And if you can throw 250 accurately with a slow fairway or mid-range, as opposed to an inconsistent 280 with a distance driver, I think I know which one I would rather have. What speed disc in your bag flies the farthest? Leave a comment down below. And also comment below what tests or comparisons you want to see in the future from our Flight Numbers Don't Matter series. Oh, and before you go, I'm excited to announce that you can now become a member of our channel. Starting from just $1 a month, you can help support the content we create and get some great perks with early access to weekly videos, priority reply to your comments, and exclusive members-only videos and live streams. Plus, if you join at $4, $7, or $10 a month, you get discounts on all orders from sixsideddiscs.com. If you're already buying discs online, why not get a discount that pays for itself? But don't worry, if you prefer to just continue watching our videos the way you always have, nothing will change for you. And if you were already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for your support, but we will be closing our Patreon on May 1st, so we would suggest canceling that before the next billing cycle and joining us here on YouTube at your earliest convenience. Thank you all very much for your support, and thank you to Idio Sports for sponsoring today's video. For Six Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. In our Flight Numbers Don't Matter series, we've set out to find the straightest putter, the straightest fairway driver, and the straightest mid-range, twice. Why? Because almost everyone agrees that a straight shot is the most difficult and sometimes most important shot in all of disc golf. But what about distance drivers? Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs. This is Flight Numbers Don't Matter, and today's video is sponsored by Mojo Gear. More about their riser in just a bit. We've gathered together this bin of 37 distance drivers, and to find the straightest distance driver, I think we first have to ask ourselves an important question. Can distance drivers actually be straight? Well, what does straight really mean in disc golf? Does it mean the disc stays straight for the entire flight? Or does it mean the disc turns a little bit and fades a bit and finishes pretty much straight ahead of where it started? I would argue both could technically be true, but what matters is, of course, the shape of the fairway you're flying. On a fairway like this, you need a disc that can fly almost completely straight the entire time, and that's hard. I've heard it said many times that a straight shot is the hardest shot in disc golf, and I've also heard it said that the faster a disc is, the harder it is to control. So by my calculations, a straight shot with a distance driver is therefore the hardest shot in all of disc golf. Either that or 28-foot putts. So how are we going to do this test today? Well, allow me to use our first disc to demonstrate. This is the MVP Catalyst. Rated at 13 speed, 5.5 glide, -2 turn and 2 fade, it was pretty close to straight. On this shot, it gets a very subtle turn, holding for a bit before a little bit of late fade. But to give you some idea of how touchy distance drivers can be, this is the same disc thrown on nearly the same angle, and it gets a completely different result. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the Catalyst here in this open field with the rest of our discs. And with a large scale comparison like this, you're probably wondering really how we went about selecting those discs. Our 37 discs are all made up of distance drivers that are 10 to 14 speed discs with a variety of turn and fade combinations, including -1-1, -2-2, -2-1, and -1-2. And what that means really in the world of distance drivers is one of two things. Either the combination of turn and fade numbers indicate that it can have a straight flight, or at least a sort of neutral stability, or it means somewhere in the marketing for that disc, it is marketed as being straight. But as we're going to find out today, straight marketing and straight flight numbers do not equal straight flights. I'll be throwing these discs at least 5 times each to make sure that I both understand what the disc is capable of, and then also show you the straightest flight that I could achieve. But that means for just this one video, I'll be doing over 200 throws, and that can certainly wear you down. In fact, it literally did. I'm on a 3-week break due to some backache I was having while throwing. And on top of all the throwing, it can be a literal pain in the back to constantly bend over to get the discs from the bag and put them back over and over and over again. And that's just one thing that today's sponsor can help with, Mojo Gear. This is the Mojo Riser. The Riser is a game-changing bag stand that attaches to almost any disc golf bag and instantly raises your bag 14 inches off the ground. Weighing in at approximately 2.5 pounds, it can support up to 50 pounds. It works on uneven ground or slopes. The height of the riser is perfect to grab putters straight from the top of your bag, as well as other important accessories like your mini or rangefinder, without bending over at all. And it keeps your towels up off the ground so they can absorb moisture from your discs and not the grass. The riser is super easy to use. Just grab the handle as you set it down, and the weight of the bag helps pull the handle and extend the legs. After you throw your shot, simply pick up the bag and the legs will automatically retract. The riser has a sturdy ABS plastic and aluminum design, and it has a cushion on the back for added comfort. And the riser is as easy to set up as it is to use. Caleb and I attached our risers to his grip bag and my Squatch bag in just a few minutes with the help of their how-to videos on their website. In fact, they recently included G-hooks for Squatch bags and some pound bags, making installation a breeze. They hook conveniently onto the loops here on the front of newer Squatch bags. But grip and Squatch are only 2 of over 75 bags the riser fits, including most medium to large bags from Squatch, Pound, Grip, Axiom, dynamic discs, and much more. You can learn more about the Mojo Riser, including bag compatibility, reviews, and setup instructions at mojogear.com or at the link in the video description. And make sure to use code SSD10 for $10 off your order. Thanks again to Mojo Gear for sponsoring today's video and supporting our channel. Now, back to the distance drivers. Since we kicked things off with a fairly straight disc, the Catalyst, I think we'll jump right to another popular distance driver from the MVP family, the Wave. Rated at 11.5 -22, the Wave is one of the most popular distance drivers in the MVP lineup, especially for amateur players. And I suspect there's a good reason for that. I was hoping that that reason would be that it's straight, but I think I found a different reason. No matter how I adjusted my release angle, power level, whatever, it just turned over. Kept turning. And even rolled. And unfortunately, that makes the Wave one of the most understable discs we tested today. The Wave, though, is available in a ton of different plastics from MVP, like Proton, Plasma, Fission, Cosmic Neutron, Eclipse, and even their new Particle Glow Proton. So I wouldn't be surprised to learn that at least one of those blends is a little more overstable than the Neutron and might be a bit straighter for my arm. So if you throw a Wave, tell us about your experience with it in the comments below. We've still got a couple MVP discs to try out later on, so there's still hope that we'll find something a little bit straighter from them. But for now, let's continue our way through our discs with -2 turn and 2 fade, because there's a bunch. Beginning with the first of 3 discs from Innova, the Shrike. The Shrike is a fast, wide-rim distance driver from Innova, rated at 13.6 -22, and it's one of just a handful of discs that Innova takes time to change flight numbers when it's in different plastics, like the -12 rating that the Shrike gets in Champion plastic here. Today, we'll actually be throwing both, and we'll start with the Champion Glow Shrike, because it's the first disc that's going to present us with a little bit of a challenge. This Shrike gets a great flight. There's definitely some turn, no denying that, and there's some late fade, and that leaves us with a fairly straight shot. But this takes us back to our earlier conundrum. What is straight? Is this straight? I think that largely depends on the fairway. So I'd say this Shrike is pretty straight, but what do you all think? Leave a comment down below. Now, as we all know, flight numbers are not all they appear to be sometimes, so you might expect this Champion Shrike, rated at 13.6 -12, to be a little straighter, maybe a touch less turn before it fades, but nope. It does this instead. Surprisingly, much more understable than the Champion Glow. So let's move on to our second Innova disc with -2 turn and 2 fade. This is the Champion Glow Turn. And this is another disc that's swapping flight numbers, because in most other plastics, like this Halo Star turn we have, it's rated with -3 turn instead of -2. But it turns out, regardless of which turn you use, they get a pretty similar flight. Take a look. Oh yeah, both get a pretty moderate turn before a little bit of low speed fade. But I'm going to say neither of those was very straight. So let's move on to our last -2-2 disc from Innova, the Beast. Rated at 10.5, -2-2, the Beast was approved by the PDGA way back in 2002. And it's quite popular among amateur players for being a fairly neutral flyer. But this Barry Schultz Champion Beast is anything but. In fact, it probably explains why it was in our used bin, because it flies like this. Surprised? So was Caleb.
We got a stable beast? Since when? Holy.
So the Shrike was by far the straightest option, at least from Innova so far, but let's move on to a few other discs, because the Shrike isn't even going to come close to our top 5 straightest discs. And we have many more discs to test, like this, the Discraft Scorch. We have 2 Scorches to test today. One is in ESP plastic, and the other is the new Fused Scorch released earlier this year. The Scorch is rated at 11.6 -2.2, and I think it's a really interesting design. The wing has always felt a little bit strange to me. It's sort of symmetrical the way that it tapers to a point on both the top and the bottom of the wing. It also has a little micro bead along the edge of the inside rim, which is certainly not common on high-speed discs. So does any of this help it fly straight? Well, the ESP Scorch is about as straight as our Champion Glow Shrike. It gets a little bit of smooth turn and then a mild fade. But the Fused Scorch is a totally different story, because it is much more overstable than your average Scorch. And while that means it isn't very straight, that's still some very useful information. One of the reasons we love testing discs in so many different plastics is it gives you an opportunity to find a shape of a disc that you like, and then sort of fine-tuning to the plastic with the right stability for your arm speed. Meaning you could take a turn or a Shrike or a Scorch and figure out which one in which plastic blend is actually going to work right for you. Alright, there's still a ton of discs in this -2.2 category, so let's move quickly through some discs that were just never anywhere close to flying straight. Like the Castaplast K1 Glow Elva, rated at 11.6 -2.2, it was super understable on every single throw. I had a similar experience with the Discmania Mentor, rated at 11.5 -2.2. It was also super understable. While the Discmania Majesty, rated at 13.5 -2.2, was super overstable. The Mentor and Majesty showing us perhaps why the active line was discontinued. And a disc with the same flight numbers as the Shrike and basically the same flight was the Goliath disc's Slingshot. And after that, that means we have so far thrown 13 discs already, and only one of them is even close to making it to our top 5 straightest distance drivers. So let's see if any of our last 3 -2.2 discs have what it takes. This is the Expanse. A new distance driver from Thought Space Athletics, the Expanse is the first disc in a new collaboration with Discraft, which is quite interesting because it puts the Expanse, rated at 11.5 -2.2, in direct competition with the Scorch that we saw a moment ago. So how does the Expanse fly in this ESP-inspired parallel plastic? Well, compared to the ESP Scorch, it's remarkably similar. It gets some turn, some fade, but again was not necessarily straight. I do think that the Expanse will be really popular among amateur players and slightly lower arm speeds because it has a much more familiar and comfortable feel in my hand compared to the Scorch. But I don't think I would count on it for tight tunnel shots. A disc that might work on tunnel shots though is this, the newest distance driver from Infinite Discs, the Sultan. Initially released at the Disc South Expo in Dallas, the Sultan is a really unusual design. While the Scorch had a micro bead on the inside rim, the Sultan has a big bead right out on the leading edge of the wing. Fortunately, you don't really feel that when you put it in your hand, so I don't think it's going to interfere with anyone's grip or release. And off the tee, the Sultan was what I would call subtle. On one shot, I got a very subtle turn and fade, while on another I got a smooth, subtle turn, even though I threw it a little too low. The Sultan is by no means the straightest disc that we threw, but I do think it has a chance to make it into the top 5. Something that I can also say for the next disc that we're going to test, the Prodigy D3. Rated at 12.6, -2.2, the D3 is our last disc in our -2.2 category, and we saved the best for last. In this white 400 plastic, it got the straightest flight so far today. With the faintest of turns, before a gentle fade, the D3 sets the standard moving forward. If you enjoy our Flight Numbers Don't Matter series, one of the best ways to support us is by purchasing one of the exact discs that we tested in our video today. For example, if you really liked the flight of this Prodigy D3 that we saw today, you can purchase this exact disc from our website for 10% off, since it's lightly used. And if you become a channel member for $3, $6, or $10 a month, you can take an additional 5, 10, or 20% off that purchase. Which means this exact Prodigy D3 would cost a top-tier member only $11.90 before shipping. Nearly every disc that we tested today will be available while supplies last on our website at the link in the video description. Thank you all very much for your support. Now let's get to our next category of discs rated with -2 turn and 1 fade. And with just 4 discs in this category, you might not expect there to be that much variety in flight characteristics. But you'd be wrong. First up is the Discmania S-Line TD. Rated at 10.5, -2.1, the TD, short for turning driver, feels much smaller in the hand than just about any disc I've thrown today. And it also turned more than just about any disc I've thrown today. Can our only gateway disc do any better? This is the Aura in NXT plastic. Rated at 12.6, -2.1, we threw the Aura just recently in a video all about gateway, and while Caleb found it to be very understable, I did not. For my backhand power, the Aura held much straighter before fading out. Still not quite the straight flight we're looking for though. Next up in our -2.1 category is the XCOM discs Draco, or DRAW for short. And this is a strange one. Firstly, you may be confused by its flight numbers, and why this disc is included in this category of -2 turn and 1 fade discs, because clearly the flight numbers on the disc say -1 turn and 2 fade. But back when we threw XCOM discs in our first impression series, we learned something kind of bizarre about their flight numbers. It turns out the turn and fade numbers are flip-flopped. So now that we know that, we can put the draw in the right category and show you its slightly understable flight. And rounding out this category is another not very straight disc, the Clash Discs Vanilla. Rated at 11.6, -2.1 in their Plenty bioplastic, the Vanilla is just not that straight. While testing it on the same day as the rest of these distance drivers, it got some turn and fade, but I found it a bit more overstable when I tested it a month or so ago for our Plastic is in the Details video on Plenty bioplastic. Needless to say, the -2.1 category didn't really deliver any contenders for straightest distance driver. And at this point in the comparison, I am sort of starting to wonder, can distance drivers achieve straight? I guess we'll find out. Let's take a look at our next category, discs with -1 turn and 2 fade. And right out of the gate, there are several discs in this category that were just way too overstable, such as the Innova Star Crate, rated at 11.5, -1.2. It flew more like an overstable Wraith, just super beefy for me on every single throw. Similarly, we have the Infinite Discs Aztec, a 10-speed that was super overstable in this Metal Flake Glow C-Blend plastic. So I figured maybe we should try the Aztec in a typically more neutral plastic blend from Infinite called iBlend. But nope, that was also very overstable. So then I thought, let's go with a disc that I've thrown in the past that I've actually seen fly somewhat straight. The Infinite Discs Ferro. But in Halo S-Blend plastic, despite being this good looking, it was also too overstable. Once again, I thought, okay, let's go with the typically more neutral iBlend plastic for the Ferro and see if we get a straighter flight. But nope, that was also overstable. Again. And to say things weren't going according to plan in this -1 turn 2 fade category is a bit of an understatement. But you never know, maybe the next disc will be less overstable. This was an Innova Star Corvette, rated at 14.6 -1.2, and it was also overstable. Okay, there's no logic on this move, but I happen to have a Corvette in Champion plastic. It's super domey. Maybe that means something. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Let's see. Whoa, okay, wow. So that's flying in a different direction. That's interesting, right? Right? All right, I need to calm down. Okay, so far this -1.2 category is a total bust, but there are 4 discs left to try and salvage something. So let's see if our very last disc from Innova can do the trick. This is the Racer. Rated at 12.6 -1.2, the Racer has a similar design to the Infinite Sultan, which of course is also made by Innova. It features a small bead out on the leading edge, and it's a disc that I wanted to do a video on months ago. So at the time I bought one from Spinners on the Green in Scottsdale, Arizona while I was on vacation, and I immediately threw it into the water at Fountain Hills. Lucky for me, Innova sent me a new one for Christmas, and it was also overstable. Next up is the only Doomsday disc we have today, the Cataclysm. Rated at 11.5 -1.2, we have it in Isolation Glow Plastic, and the design is very similar to the Discraft Scorch, and so is the flight, because it was quick to turn like the ESB Scorch. But more importantly, it was not straight. And neither was the Prodigy H3V2, also rated at 11.5 -1.2, because it was super understable. Our last disc in the -1.2 category is the Discmania Enigma. Here in Lux Vapor Plastic, it's a 12-speed from Discmania's Evolution line, and it looks and feels great. But in terms of achieving a straight flight, I think the best thing I can say is that it was in fact the straightest -1.2 disc we tested. Though that's not saying much. Now, there were 2 discs that we had today in this whole bin, this whole lineup, that didn't really fit any of these flight number categories. So let's take a look at those 2 now. The first is the Finish Line Era. The Era is rated at 10.5 -1.51, and it's marketed by Finish Line as a straight distance driver. I've heard some people refer to it as a longer buzz, which is a big claim for a disc that flies like this. I've thrown the Era many times, and unfortunately for my arm, it's just way too overstable. Finish Line is owned by Drew Gibson, so I can only assume that these discs work better for somebody with a little more oomph. Another disc I had high hopes for was another one of Castoplast's newer distance drivers, the Voss. Swedish for sharp, the Voss is rated at 12.5 -1.52, and the shape and feel in my hand is great. It seems like it should be a candidate for a straight flight, so I gave it a few throws, but as I'm sure you can see, a pattern emerged. Yet another overstable flight from a neutrally rated disc. And to say that I was frustrated while recording this video is a massive understatement. I took a lot of time selecting these discs, either based on flight numbers, the marketing that said they would be straight, or the fact that someone, somewhere at some point, said that they threw them straight. And so far, there's just not much to show for that. Maybe a straight shot with a distance driver really is the hardest shot in disc golf, and maybe I'm not up for the task. I guess we'll soon know for sure because we have just 4 distance drivers left to try and salvage something and find a straight flight. So let's get into our final category and perhaps the one with the most potential: distance drivers with -1 turn and 1 fade. And we begin this category with 2 allegedly straight discs from DGA, the Undertow and Rogue. Rated at 10 for -11 and 11 for -11 respectively, they both sound like they should be pretty straight. But say it with me, everyone, flight numbers don't matter, because the Undertow flew like this, and the Rogue flew like this. Now, DGA recently did a complete overhaul of their plastics, so it's entirely possible that one of the new blends of the Rogue will fly maybe more true to the way it was intended. But we'll never know for the Undertow because it has since been discontinued, which means we have just 1 mold left in 2 different plastics, and it really is our only hope. This is the MVP Neutron Trail, and this is the MVP Proton Trail. Rated at 10.5, -11, the Trail would easily win 2024 Disc of the Year if that were an award given out by someone, because it was a runaway success. Selling out repeatedly throughout last season, we put in more orders for the Trail than any other disc. In fact, we did not 1 video on the Trail, but 2, and both were a huge success. And there's no doubt in my mind that it is pretty darn straight. Or is it? Well, in Neutron plastic, it was a tad more understable. But this is a pretty mild turn compared to a lot of the discs that we saw today. Whereas in Proton plastic, the Trail finally delivered what we've been looking for all day: a pretty darn straight flight. Is it as straight as the straightest mid-range that we found in those previous videos? Not even close. But by distance driver standards, it's pretty darn straight. So where does that leave our top 5 straightest distance drivers? Well, remember, I threw each of these discs at least 5 times, and these were the straightest flights that I could achieve. Starting at number 5, the Discmania Enigma. Despite a bit of a higher release, the Enigma still gets a subtle turn and fade for a straight-ish flight. At number 4, the Infinite Sultan. One of the strangest designs yielded some pretty nice flights, and the Sultan is well worth a look if you're shopping for a neutral distance driver. Number 3, the MVP Catalyst. The Axiom Tenacity actually used to be the straightest flying disc in my bag a few years ago, and the Catalyst has a very similar design. And I would recommend it either to lower arm speeds looking for straighter flights, or faster arm speeds looking for hyzer flip turnover shots. And number 2, the Prodigy D3. I didn't know what to expect from the D3, but I did not expect it to have such an incredibly straight flight. Very impressive. And unsurprisingly, at number 1, it's the MVP Trail. But not just any trail, specifically this Proton Trail. While the Neutron Trail has been in my bag for a while and gets some decent distance, I think this Proton Trail gets a little less turn and less fade by comparison, delivering overall a straighter flight, and by far the straightest today. Now, I want to be clear, these are not the straightest distance drivers on the market. They were the straightest distance drivers for me, my arm on this day in these conditions. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will fly straight for you. But if you think that you throw with a similar speed or technique to myself, then you might find some of the discs that worked well for me will work well for you. What did you think of our results? Have you thrown any of these distance drivers? Let us know in the comments below. And also comment below what tests and comparisons you'd like to see next on Flight Numbers Don't Matter. Huge thanks again to Mojo Gear for supporting our channel. Be sure to use code SSD10 for $10 off your Mojo Riser at mojogear.com or at the link in the video description. And finally, huge thanks to all of our members for your support. Click the join button below to learn more about how you can become a member and get great perks like early access to these videos, discounts on our website, and more. For Six-Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. Some advice that I've heard given to newer disc golfers more times than I can count is to throw slower discs like putters and mid-ranges, because when you're new, putters and mid-ranges fly just as far as your drivers will. And if the beginning of this video sounds familiar, that's because it is. About a month ago, we posted a video called Which Speed Flies the Farthest, where we took 13 discs from Discraft, speed 1 to 13, and gave them to 4 different players of different skill levels and with very different arm speeds to try and find out if there's any truth to the idea that slower discs fly farther for slower arms. And in that video, our data proved that to be false. Faster, more aerodynamic discs like fairways and distance drivers almost always flew farther. So why are we back here talking about it again? Well, to put it simply, you all had some excellent feedback, and we listened to feedback. You see, last time we threw stable to understable discs from Discraft, and you all said we should do this test again with overstable discs, and I couldn't agree more. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six-Sided Discs, and this is Flight Numbers Don't Matter, where we conduct large-scale tests and comparisons to try and learn anything we can about flight numbers, stability, and much more. Now, the reason you all suggested using overstable discs is that we were likely to see a bigger change in distance from player to player. Our MPO thrower, Caleb, throws over 60 miles an hour, and he should easily be able to get some overstable discs to turn over, while the rest of us probably won't. So this is probably our best chance to really see if slower discs can fly farther. In addition to changing stability, we're also mixing things up and changing brands today and moving to an all Innova-made lineup. Because Innova doesn't really have any overstable-ish 1-speed discs, the closest we could come up with is this R-Blend Glyph from Infinite Discs. R-Blend is similar to Innova's R-Pro plastic, and the Glyph feels like a polecat with a thumb track. Quite unusual. Moving up in speed from there, we'll be throwing the 2-speed Champion Rhino, a 3-speed Infinite Discs Alpaca, and the Alpaca was honestly the closest thing I could get to an overstable 3-speed from Innova or Infinite. From here on out though, we do definitely have some moderately overstable discs right the way through, including the flat top overstable Champion Toro, a Halo Star Rock 3 for our 5-speed, a 6-speed Innova Gazelle in Protoglow Metal Flake Champion plastic, a Champion T-Bird and T-Bird 3 for our 7 and 8-speed slots. I even snagged this sweet old Big Germ Thunderbird from a few years ago for our 9-speed. At 10, we switch back to Infinite Discs to grab the Roman, which is very similar to the old Discmania PD that Innova made. And then we have a few Innova classics, an 11-speed Wraith, 12-speed Destroyer, and 13-speed Boss. And finally, closing out our lineup is this Domi Star Colossus at speed 14. And just like before, we have 4 different players testing these for us. Team Six-Sided Discs Caleb Thomas is throwing for MPO today. His backhand can reach 65 miles an hour or more. I'll be throwing today for the MA2 level, and since I'm basically not throwing backhands anymore, more on that in an upcoming video, I will be throwing all of these on forehand. Our friend Josh is throwing for us again at the MA4 or casual level today, and my wife Emily is throwing for FA4 or casual. Once again, neither of them have ever played in a tournament, so the division is more indicative of what they would play if they did. Just like last time, we'll be throwing these discs multiple times in an open field, and the goal is distance, not accuracy. So once each player has registered what they feel is the maximum distance they can get with each disc, we'll enter those into our graph, which may look something like this. And once again, we'll be looking to see if we can find any trends in the data from player to player or disc to disc, and then we'll also be able to compare this video's data with our last video as well. Let's kick things off at the FA4 level with my wife, Emily. She has a natural high anhyzer release, so these overstable discs may have an opportunity to flex out, or they may sky upwards and backwards. The Glyph is a tricky disc to get used to, and unsurprisingly, for as blunt-nosed as it is, Emily only got about 135 feet from it. But she got some decent distance with the Rhino at 160 feet, and the Alpaca and Toro were the first discs to really show us the flights we're expecting for lower arm speeds with these types of discs, starting them out on some anhyzer before they fight out and fade. This is really the only way Emily was going to get any distance from these discs. She had another solid throw with the Rock 3 at 185 feet. But past that, it was difficult to add much distance until she got just the perfect angle with the Halo Star Wraith. The Wraith pushed out to 225 feet, but this is essentially where Emily hit her distance ceiling, because the Destroyer, and particularly the Boss and Colossus, were just way too overstable to get any kind of distance. We'll compare Emily's overstable to understable data a little bit later, but first, let's take a look at Josh's numbers. Josh kicked things off with 212 feet on the Glyph, 229 on the Rhino, and 230 on the Alpaca. The Toro, though, is quite a bit more overstable and has a lot less glide than the first 3 discs, so unsurprisingly, the distance drops off there to 222. Josh got a great rip on the Rock 3 at 250 feet. And even better on the Gazelle at 290. And his distance continued to steadily increase, 313 with the Thunderbird. 326 with the Colossus. And finally, his best throw of them all, 330 feet with the Destroyer. Josh's final chart here shows a sharply increasing distance from lower to higher speed discs. Definitive results on their own, but we still have 2 throwers to go. But before we get there, a quick word from today's sponsor, our YouTube members. That's right, you can join our channel as a member for just $1 a month and get some great benefits like early access to videos, priority reply to comments, and more. And if you join at either of the top 3 tiers, you get discounts on every order from our website, sixsidediscs.com, where you can shop over 20 brands and accessories of all your favorites in the world of disc golf, with pictures of every disc and free shipping over $50. So please consider supporting the content we create by clicking the join button below this video or making your next disc purchase from sixsidediscs.com. Thank you for your support. Now, though, it's my turn to get my hands on these discs and let a rip. Now, if you've followed our channel at all, you may know that I've been having a few on and off again injuries with my elbow last year and most recently with my back. Luckily, though, my forehand still works quite well, because once we get past these discs that are pretty hard to throw on forehand, like the Glyph at 218, the Rhino at 187, or the Alpaca at 190, the only way to go was up. I got the Toro out to 247, which is probably the maximum I could get with an approach disc like that. And then I steadily increased distance with each of the next few discs, like 273 feet for the Rock 3, 306 feet for the Gazelle, 324 for the T-Bird, and 345 for the T-Bird 3. And then my third best distance with the Thunderbird at 359. However, there were definitely some struggles with some of the distance drivers. The 10-speed Roman was a little bit tricky for me. The Boss was way too overstable. And the Colossus was kind of all over the place. So none of those got big numbers. But the Destroyer, at 371 feet, was my second farthest throw, before I clocked my best of the bunch with the Halo Star Wraith at 378 feet. And to be honest, I didn't know I could throw that far. So that's cool. What my chart shows, though, is a very steep increase in distance as the speed of the disc goes up. And at least for me personally, on forehand, slower discs are really difficult to get a clean release with. And that's why we see such a huge, steep increase in my distance numbers specifically. Let's move on, though, and head to the biggest arm around here, Team Six-Sided Discs, Caleb Thomas. Now, first and foremost, because we have 4 different throwers here, we had to throw on different days. Emily and Josh threw on the same day, while Caleb and I threw on a separate day, which, for the purposes of today's data, is relevant because while I had a very helping wind on my throws, Caleb did not, which is going to make his distances seem a little shorter than expected. At any rate, let's watch Caleb let a rip on these discs. Across the first 5 discs, Caleb had a fairly consistent and moderate increase in distance. But as soon as we hit the fairway drivers, the numbers shoot up. He crushed the Gazelle out to 393 feet, and the Champion T-Bird out to 381. Caleb had mixed success with the T-Bird 3, Thunderbird, Roman, and Wraith because they all failed to deliver anything much farther. But because Caleb's got that little extra power and spin, he was able to get big distance from the Destroyer, his second best at 400 feet. And wouldn't you know it, the fastest disc of the bunch, the Colossus, was his best distance at 403 feet. Now, Caleb's results were pretty much in line with the rest of us. We see, again, a steady increase in distance all the way up. And this is effectively what we saw in our previous test with Discraft discs. I want to take a moment to look at each player's datasets side by side, comparing these stable to understable discs to overstable discs, just in terms of distance. Here's a quick side by side of Emily's numbers, and surprisingly, her farthest throw with an overstable disc was better than her farthest with a stable to understable disc. Josh also had better distance with overstable discs than with understable or stable discs, which is, again, surprising. My data shows just how touchy the faster understable discs were compared to more overstable discs. And again, my distance improved with the overstable discs by quite a bit. Caleb's data, however, isn't really worth comparing, because the left-to-right crosswind we had while he was throwing these overstable discs was pushing his shots down as soon as they started to fade. Now, in our previous test, there was a moderate increase in distance as the speed of the disc increased. But I was really surprised to see that not only continue today with overstable discs, but seemingly increase even more, especially for myself. And I think it definitively disproves the idea that putters and mid-ranges will fly farther for anyone, as far as I'm concerned. My theory on why that might be happening is that stable to understable discs effectively reach this sort of breaking point, a point of no return, where if you throw them any harder, faster, or with more spin, they are just going to turn and burn. But with overstable discs, you can essentially throw them as hard and fast as you want, unless you're one of a few very elite throwers in the world. And what that means is that for Caleb and I, we could just rip on these discs as hard as possible, and then let their stability figure out the rest. The slower discs were, of course, still limited by their aerodynamic properties. Fairway drivers and distance drivers will always fly faster, have less wind resistance, and should fly farther. So, does speed equal distance? Yes. Does speed also equal less accuracy? Also yes. There are, of course, drawbacks to throwing faster discs, especially when you're new. But if we're purely talking about distance, there's a reason they call them distance drivers in the first place. What overstable disc flies the farthest for you? Leave a comment down below. And also comment below what large-scale tests and comparisons you'd like to see in the future on Flight Numbers Don't Matter. For Six-Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. This is an Innova Destroyer. This is also an Innova Destroyer. This has the same flight numbers as a Destroyer, but so does this disc. So why do they all fly so different? Because flight numbers don't matter. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six-Sided Discs, and today's video is sponsored by Smuggler's Notch Resort. More on them in just a bit. A little over 2 years ago, we posted the first video in this series, and since then we've tested and compared flight characteristics and distances of hundreds of putters, mid-ranges, fairways, and distance drivers from dozens of different manufacturers. But it's finally time for us to revisit the numbers that started it all. Destroyers. Rated at 12.5, -1.3, the Innova Destroyer is the standard by which nearly every max distance driver is judged these days. One of the reasons we started this series and called it Flight Numbers Don't Matter is because how manufacturers go about choosing their flight numbers is a total mystery, and what flight numbers mean to one manufacturer or another seem to be completely different. For example, the straight mid-range slot from Innova, Discmania, and Discraft all have different flight numbers, ranging from 5500 to 5501 to 54-11. And while those numbers aren't that different, every time we post a video talking about straight mid-ranges, we get some Innova fans in the comments saying, what about the Innova Rock or Rock 3? Which are rated at 4403 and 5403 respectively. And I don't know about you, but those flight numbers sound pretty overstable to me, whether they actually are or not. This once again shows just how differently each company interprets and assigns flight numbers and what they really mean with those numbers. Another reason we started this series is because many players often shop for discs based on flight numbers, which makes total sense. It is, after all, the primary way discs are marketed by manufacturers and retailers alike, including us. But since every manufacturer approaches this differently, it's hard to know how accurate flight numbers actually are. And that's all before we consider all the other factors that affect how a disc flies, like plastic, weight, and the individual player. So today we'll be doing what we always do in this series, trying to make sense of flight numbers. But instead of choosing only discs with exactly 12.5-13 flight numbers, we're going to branch out and also include some 11 to 13 speed discs that are designed to be maximum distance drivers. Discs that can get a little bit of turn, but also a reliable fade for consistent, reliable distance. We have 34 different distance drivers today. And just like in our very first Flight Numbers Don't Matter video, we're going to be trying to figure out what type of destroyer each of those discs are. To do that, though, we will first need to explore the destroyers themselves. And here they are. 8 different destroyers in a variety of plastics and weights, because not all destroyers are created equal. For example, there are the flippy destroyers, like this Echo Star destroyer. Echo Star is Innova's recycled plastic, and despite being max weight, this particular destroyer is super understable. This Paul Macbeth 4-time Star Destroyer is quite understable for a different reason. One is that it's quite well used, but perhaps more importantly, it's the lightest destroyer we've ever found, 138 grams. Now, destroyers that fly that understable are a rarity, unless they're made in DX plastic. Either way, we will be watching to see if any of these other discs with similar flight numbers fly anywhere near as understable as these. Next, we have the max distance drivers, and for this slot today we have one random Star Destroyer at max weight, and a well-seasoned Halo Destroyer. And both of these show a nice forward push, or even a slight turn, before a reliable fade. And this is what most people want from a destroyer: consistent, reliable distance. In fact, while this comparison is not necessarily about distance, and we didn't measure every shot, we did measure the best ones, and this Halo Destroyer had Josh's best distance of the day of over 150 throws at 465 feet. And finally, these are the big dogs, the beefy boys, and we have several. Now, people will claim to know what makes one disc more overstable than another, like dome or parting line height or any one of a list of many other characteristics. And some of the time those things are true, but sometimes they aren't, as we've found out in the past. For example, if you had asked me which of these destroyers would have been most overstable, I probably would have picked the Halo Destroyer. And I definitely would not have picked this, a G-Star Destroyer, because despite G-Star's reputation for being a much more understable plastic, this was still very overstable. We also threw another random max weight Star Destroyer that was very overstable. This Champion Destroyer, also very overstable. And finally, this Ricky Wysocki 2-time Destroyer that's extremely domey, 165 grams, and is an absolute meat hook. And so there you have it. These are our 3 categories: overstable, understable, and just right. And that means our next task is to see where these other 26 distance drivers fit on our chart. So let's get started. With a disc we threw for the first time a couple months ago, the Gateway Realm. Rated at 12.5-13, the Realm is Gateway's new flagship distance driver. It feels a tad smaller in the hand than a Destroyer, and Gateway's NXT plastic has a nice combination of grip and flex. Josh puts a move on this realm. It's a little bit high, but it starts on hyzer and with a good nose angle, and therefore can find some turn before it fights out. And that just about lines up with how this exact disc flew for Caleb a couple months ago. While Caleb had a little lower angle on it, it still got some turn and plenty of fight back for easy distance. Which means our very first disc is also the first to make it into the just right category. Next, let's have a look at one of the newest distance drivers on the market, the Westside Tide. The Tide is a new distance driver from Westside Discs, released earlier this year. It's rated at 12.6, -0.53. Westside say that it has the perfect combination of reach and accuracy. So let's see if they're right. Once again, on a slight hyzer release, Josh gets it to flip up to flat and hold for a moment before fading out. And as we know, that's one way to get pretty consistent distance. But before you get lulled into the feeling that this whole video is just beautiful flights on a bright sunny day, let me show you a few discs that were a bit different. This is the Elevation Discs Psychic. Known for their floppy rubber and their very popular koi putter, this is their first distance driver. The Psychic is rated at 12.5, -1.2, and if you've watched our channel for any amount of time, you'll know we've loved covering, but struggled throwing, rubber discs.
Well, that's not in one piece anymore.
And I would never set up anyone for failure, but I may have neglected to tell Josh about the challenges that we've had throwing rubber discs.
Very interested to see how you throw this.
I'm scared. You want me to go get it?
Sure, yeah, let's try again.
Impressively though, Josh managed to pull off a great shot on his second attempt, and while it came out a bit low, it drifts a bit before gently fading, resulting in one of the straightest, but also one of the shortest shots of the day at just over 300 feet. The Psychic is tough to get used to, and I don't think I can say it flies like any Destroyer, so it's going to go in this new category, not quite. Another disc that was quite different was the Axiom Defy. Here in Proton Plastic, this is an older Defy. It's board flat, and despite having flight numbers of 11.5, -1.3, almost every Defy I've ever thrown has been incredibly overstable. But even I was shocked to see how this one flew. Josh puts it on a slight hyzer, which was the plan for all these throws, and the Defy just goes left, and more left. So the Defy goes about as far left as a disc could go, and we'll move on from some discs that were not quite to a place that's just right. Smuggler's Notch Resort. Smuggler's Notch Resort in Jeffersonville, Vermont is home to two of the highest rated disc golf courses in the world, Brewster Ridge and Fox Run Meadows. We recently visited Smugs for the first disc golf stay-and-play weekend of the year. They have several stay-and-play weekends throughout the summer months, and in addition to lodging, access to these iconic courses, your stay also includes a 9-hole glow round, where trees and OB lines are marked with colorful lights. You also get breakfast vouchers to enjoy the dangerously delicious Vermont maple syrup, as well as a Vermont craft beer package. You would struggle to find a location better suited to a disc golf vacation than Smuggler's Notch Resort. From the fun zone, great food, and much more, there's fun to be had for the whole family. You can learn more about booking your disc golf stay-and-play weekend at smugs.com at the link in the video description, or call Group Vacations at 1-800-521-0536. And to help you make your decision, we shot several videos during our trip to Smugs, including a vlog of our entire trip and an 18-hole Q&A walk and talk round at Fox Run Meadows. So make sure you check those out to see what it's actually like to stay and play at one of the world's best disc golf properties. Use code 6sided to let them know we sent you. And thanks again to Smuggler's Notch Resort for supporting our channel. Now, let's get back to the Destroyers with a disc that we threw for the first time just a few months ago, the Birdie Reach. Here in their premium plastic, the Birdie Reach is rated at 12.5, -1.3, and it shows us what a just right flight can be. Turning long enough to get solid distance before a nice, generous fade, And that's pretty much exactly what you want from a destroyer type disc. Our next disc comes from Innova's own factory, the Infinite Discs Emperor. Here in their Halo S-Blend plastic, or in other words, Halo Star, it's rated at 12.5, -1, 2.5. And the Emperor is a beefy one. It holds straight briefly, but gets a significant late fade. I would trust the Halo Emperor in a headwind, and so should you. Moving on now to my go-to distance driver, and the first disc that we're looking at with slightly different flight numbers, the Latitude 64 Rive. Rated at 13.50, 3.5, I felt it was important in this test and comparison to include some discs that don't have destroyer flight numbers, but are filling that sort of flagship distance driver slot within their company. The Rive has been my go-to forehand driver for some time now, but how does it fly for Josh? Well, slightly on the overstable side, I think. It almost flips to flat, but not quite, and it has a pretty generous fade. And that's fairly consistent with my experience with it as well. So the Rive lands itself right here in the overstable column. Next up is another 13-speed, the Discraft ESP Nuke. With 5 glide, -1 turn, and 3 fade, the Nuke is one of Discraft's best-selling drivers. And while we'll take a look at their other destroyerish drivers, the Zeus and Force, later, the Nuke is well worth a throw today. We're testing this beautiful swirly ESP Nuke that I picked up at D-Glow a few years ago, and it's good news, because it flies as good as it looks. Josh gets the Nuke to flip up to flat, drift a bit, before finishing out around 400 feet. And for that shot shape and that distance on a lower line, the Nuke is 100% just right. Unfortunately, it was not smooth sailing for the rest of our 13-speed drivers. We gave the new Westside Prince a shot, a 13-speed driver designed in collaboration with MA2. It's rated at 13.503. Josh's first throw with the Prince made it look pretty overstable, but also seemed a touch high, so I had him throw it again, which was also super beefy. One more try then, and yeah, I guess the Prince is just a real beefy boy. The House of Discs family of brands includes Latitude 64, Westside, Castoplast, Discmania, and Dynamic Discs. And they make a lot of discs that fit this slot. And while we don't have time for all of them today, we do have time for 2 more, starting with the Castoplast K1 Gold. Rated at 13.5, -0.53, the Gold was introduced around the time Castoplast discontinued the Grim and Grim X. And it may have finally solved Castoplast's distance driver challenges, because it flew great. Pushing a good bit straighter than the Prince, it still had plenty of reliable fade. So that's that. Or is it? Because on another throw, on a similar angle,
Whoa!
Josh got a huge turn from the Gold before it faded out. Now, of all the discs that we tested today, the Gold struggled to just show us a consistent flight path. And it was one that we never really felt like we understood. So it's going to fit right about here on the edge of Understable to just right with a little asterisk. And we'll move on to another House of Discs disc, the Latitude 64 Strive. When the Strive was first released, I was immediately interested. I already bagged the Rive, I love the Rive, and it's pretty overstable, so I figured maybe I can get the Strive to just get a touch more turn and more distance. But the Strive and I have never jived, so it's all Rive for me. But for Josh, well, I'm not sure he's signing up for stock alerts on the Strive either, because on a couple throws, it was super understable, like so.
Didn't see that coming.
But on another, it wouldn't really turn at all. Pushed straight and then, admittedly, aided by some wind, I assume, got a huge fade. Which means the Strive straddles a new line around the not quite category, I guess, and we move on to our last 13-speed distance driver, the Prodigy 400 Falcor. Rated at 13.5, -1, 2.5, it was released as a collaboration with Kale Leviska a few years ago. The Falcor has always felt pretty good in my hand, but I guess not good enough to convince me to try it because I've never thrown one. And I still haven't, but Josh has, and it's tough because it means that only the Nuke delivered a truly great flight for the 13 speeds, as the Falcor was surprisingly overstable on multiple throws. Certainly not where I would have expected it to end up, but the flights don't lie. So let's move back to some discs that have more destroyer-y flight numbers, starting with the dynamic discs Trespass. Rated at 12.5, -0.53, the Trespass was included in our first destroyer comparison, and in Lucid plastic it was outrageously understable. But today we're testing it in two different plastics. A stiffer version of Lucid called Lucid X, along with their glow plastic, Moonshine. Both of these are slightly domey, pretty stiff, and feel great. And they fly nothing like the Trespass did a couple years ago. Both of these were much more overstable, and rightly earn a spot in our Overstable column. And this is a great time for me to remind you all that we do not intend for these tests to be definitive. These are simply how these discs flew for this thrower, Josh, on this particular day in these somewhat windy conditions. As many of you likely already know, discs vary a lot, from run to run, plastic to plastic, weight to weight, and person to person. But if you like how some of these discs flew, you can find the exact discs we threw, while supplies last, on our website, sixsideddiscs.com. Discs that we've thrown in our videos are 10% off since they're lightly used, and channel members get 5, 10, or 20% off their purchases. Now let's see our next disc, the Discraft Zeus. Rated at 12.5, -1.3, the Zeus was the second disc in Paul Macbeth's line, released back in 2018. Eagle-eyed viewers might recognize this exact Zeus from a previous video, where we tried to find the fastest way to beat in a disc. It turns out being mean to discs isn't particularly effective.
Where did you get that stamp? The toilet store? I bet you've never even seen an ace. You suck, Zeus. You wouldn't even know how to fade in Photoshop. Look at you, you stupid guy with a cigar and hair. Ah!
And since this one made it through that unscathed, it's ready to fly today. And boy, does it. The Z-Roll Zeus gets a beautiful flight, one of the best we've seen all day. It gets this slow pushing turn without turning over for huge distance. Just right is an understatement. But can another Discraft distance driver follow suit? Here in a limited edition stamp from something. Honestly, I don't know where this Z-Force came from. It's technically my son's disc. What I can tell you is that it's stiff, domey, and max weight. So how will it compare to the Zeus? Well, I'm not sure what it was about the Force, but it just didn't work out today. When we make these videos, there's actually quite a few discs that you don't get to see. Discs that we tried and couldn't get consistent flights from. In this case, we couldn't seem to get the angle we wanted from the Force. At first glance, it looks super overstable on every shot. But after going through these shots again, I don't think we ever got the nose angle that we wanted. So while it had tons and tons of fade, that may not really be a good representation of its true flight characteristics. Some discs that we did get good flights from, though, include the Goliath discs Rapture, which got some nice turn and a moderate fade, landing it firmly in the just right column. Two other discs that were just right were the Clash Salt in steady plastic and the CNC Plus from Protoflight. Both of them delivered a really nice blend of turn and fade for big distance. And another excellent flight came from a new version of an old classic, the Discmania Cloudbreaker. Gannon Burr's Horizon C-Line Cloudbreaker, still available at sixsideddiscs.com, looks incredible, and it has the flight to match those good looks. Josh gets a nice forward push here before that reliable fade kicks in. And I will say, it's still on the pretty overstable side and would need some beating in before it fits into that just right column. Interestingly, it wasn't the only Cloudbreaker I had handy, because I found this Eagle McMahon S-Line Cloudbreaker 3 hanging out on a shelf in my basement. And while it didn't get quite as much turn, it still flew really nice, pushing straight before a generous fade. Both cloud breakers are overstable, but still quite usable. However, the same could not be said for these two discs, the Meridian discs Chasm or our Axiom time-lapse. The Chasm, which we threw for the first time earlier this year, was just as overstable as I remembered. Way too beefy. And surprisingly, so was our Axiom time-lapse. I've seen some time-lapses get big turn. I've heard people theorize about colors that are more or less stable, and I think even Simon has talked a little bit about that. But whatever it is, it was beefy. That being said, Josh did have one shot with it that went crazy far. Only 5 feet short of the best distance he had with the Halo Star Destroyer earlier, the time-lapse did 460 feet with almost no turn at all. Still, both of them were overstable, unlike this disc, the Viking Odin. And honestly, I owe this disc a debt of gratitude, because without it, you might not even be watching this video. I had this idea of flight numbers don't matter bubbling for a while, but I needed proof. Proof that the idea I had was actually true. So we took a destroyer and this very Odin to a field over 2 years ago and recorded this. And 2 years later, it's still quite understable, especially for a disc with flight numbers of 12.5, -1.3. So, here's to you, Odin. Thanks for doing what you do. Just 2 more discs remain, and we saved some good ones for last. The Hooligan Yeet and the DGA Hurricane. We threw the Yeet for the first time recently, and we were immediately impressed. It has stability that can work for many different players. Slower arms will find it generously overstable, while big arms can get effortless distance, which was quite similar to our experience with the DGA Hurricane in their new Atmos plastic. It looks good, feels great, and on hyzer, it likes to flip over, drift out, and swing back for all the distance you could ever need. Which leaves us with this finished chart of destroyers and their friends. Now remember, even after showing you all these flights, I'm not saying that this is how your Hurricane, Realm, Yeet, or Nuke is actually gonna fly. Only that this is how they flew for us. And while I've heard some people say recently online that there's no need for disc comparisons like ours, I'm afraid I have to disagree. Discs may be flawed, and it may be impossible for companies to produce them exactly the same each and every time. But that's not going to stop us here at Six Sided Discs from being curious, asking questions, and testing them for ourselves. Because even if the results aren't definitive, I think there's still something to take away from exploring and learning and testing as many discs as we can get our hands on. You can find many of the exact discs we threw today at sixsideddiscs.com or at the link in the video description. What did you think of our results? And how do these discs fly for you? Leave a comment down below. And also comment below what large-scale comparisons you'd like to see next on Flight Numbers Don't Matter. Thanks again to Smuggler's Notch Resort for sponsoring today's video. Use code SIXSIDED at smugs.com or call Group Vacations at 1-800-521-0536 to book your disc golf stay-and-play weekend today. For Six Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. You see this? This right here? What do you call this? A thumb track? A groove top? A reverse dome? A concave flight plate? Whatever you call it, you might think it exists just to improve your grip. But there's more than meets the eye. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs, and this is Flight Numbers Don't Matter, where we conduct large-scale tests and comparisons of discs to better understand flight numbers, stability, and lots of other things. However, today is not about comparing a bunch of discs against each other. No, today is about understanding a term that's relatively new in the world of disc golf: surface technologies. All discs approved by the PDGA have one thing in common: they're round. Most of them also have many other things in common. They're typically injection molded, consisting of a top and bottom mold. And no matter what you call them, putter, fairway driver, mid-range, or
radially symmetrical, gyroscopically stabilized aerofoil,
they all use the same physics to fly. A disc is a wing, a circular wing, and if you push it straight with no rotation, it generates lift, just like a wing. But by adding rotation, you add stability, and hey presto, the disc flies. How it flies through the air after that is determined by a whole bunch of things that fit into 3 categories: the manufacturer, the thrower, and the conditions. Conditions are environmental factors that affect both the thrower and the disc, like wind direction and speed, humidity, temperature, elevation, and more. The thrower, of course, changes how they throw based on the conditions and disc selection, adjusting their nose angle, launch angle, trajectory, speed, and spin. And finally, we have the manufacturer's molding process, their plastic selection, and the conditions where it was made, how long and how quickly it was cooled. All of these things ultimately change how the disc may fly. And recently, manufacturers have begun experimenting even more with surface technologies. What are surface technologies, and why do they need a special name? Well, allow me to explain. Surface technologies refer to anything that changes the top of the flight plate, or perhaps the bottom of the flight plate as well. Latitude 64 introduced a line of discs a few years ago with golf ball-style dimples, called the Hex line. The idea was that it would create less drag, and therefore fly farther. But given that they're now out of production, it's safe to say that wasn't quite what people were looking for. Castoplast, which started out as a small prototyping shop, made the Rask, a double-rimmed disc with a second miniature flight plate along the bottom, which feels especially nice in a forehand grip. However, adding more weight towards the center of a disc doesn't really help with stability. And according to many people I've talked to, the Rask struggles to fly consistently. The most common form of surface technology is this: the humble thumb track. And thumb track discs are nothing new. The Innova Rhino's been around since 1998. But if there's one surface technology that has staying power and is still innovating, it's this one. Because there are tons of thumb track discs that are pretty similar to the Rhino. In fact, Innova alone makes at least 5 other discs with thumb tracks, including the Pig, Birdie, Animal, Wolf, and Zephyr. Discraft have the Zone GT, the Banger GT, Ringer GT, and Buzz GT. GT in this case stands for Groove Top, or in other words, a rebranded thumb track. And there are tons of others from Lone Star, Reptilian, Castoplast, Streamline, and of course, Gateway. Gateway owner and disc designer Dave McCormick was one of the early adopters of thumb tracks. He experimented with surface technologies and is responsible for the subtle thumb track on the Reptilian Serpent and Scale, as well as a couple AGL putters, the popular thumb-tracked approach discs from Gateway like the Devilhawk and Ghoul, and the not-so-subtle raised edge on the Reptilian Stego. The Stego's design, though, probably doesn't quite qualify as a thumb track. And in fact, Dave doesn't call it that at all. Instead, he refers to this as a spoiler, like on a sports car. Which takes us back to disc design in general. Most companies focus their design on the leading edge, but it turns out most surface technologies have nothing to do with the leading edge at all, because as you can see here, airflow over the top of the disc doesn't touch the thumb track until it arrives here, the trailing edge. And this is why the Stego's design is referred to as a spoiler, because as the disc flies through the air traveling over the flight plate pushes down on this raised edge. And not only does this create more drag to add overstability, but it also tips the disc nose up, further increasing drag and adding even more overstability. The Stego is famous for its absurd overstability, but while most discs get more understable the faster you throw them, the Stego does not. Neither does the Discmania Tilt or Discraft Zone OS. This is because drag increases the faster something goes. It affects planes, cars, literally anything, including our discs. And the latest disc to employ a thumb track style surface technology is this, the Streamline Turbulence. MVP says they've added the reduced glide and comfort of the Range, their first ergonomic low glide disc, to their latest fairway driver. And in my hand, the Turbulence feels incredible. It's shallow, the ergonomic shape feels great in both a backhand and forehand grip. And off the tee, it's cool, but first let's take a walk down memory lane to see how some of these other thumb-tracked discs fly. Beginning with the Rhino. With famously low glide, it's popular with everyone from your local amateurs to Calvin Heimberg, and in an upcoming video we'll be comparing it in a bunch of different plastics. But all we need to see today is just how it doesn't glide, and drops out of the sky. And in general, this is what thumb track discs are good at: less glide, more overstability, and accuracy. There are more than a few discs that fly similarly to the Rhino, such as the Innova Pig, or perhaps the reverse dome Luftdiscs Neon, which takes things a step further and creates so much drag that you can see the moment it can no longer achieve flight. One of the newest thumb track discs on the market is the latest collaboration between ThoughtSpace Athletics and Discraft, the Vessel. If the design of the Vessel looks familiar, that's because it is. In late 2023, Discraft released the Zone GT Battle Pack. Inside were a pair of test flight Zone GTs. Instead of choosing just one disc to release as the Zone GT, Discraft was conflicted because the Ringer GT's subtle spoiler-like thumb track and the Banger GT's smoother, wider, and deeper thumb track couldn't be more different. So Discraft packaged them together, encouraging tournament directors to host Zone GT Battle Pack events, where each pack would come with a QR code where you could vote for which one you wanted Discraft to put into production. And I and everyone else I talked to thought for sure that this Ringer GT top Zone GT would win. But somehow, the Banger GT top won. And that was that, until earlier this year. In early 2025, ThoughtSpace Athletics announced a partnership with Discraft and has since released a neutral distance driver, the Expanse, along with an understable fairway driver, the Persona. And both are solid discs in their own right. The Vessel joins that lineup in their premium Vex plastic, an often sparkly, metallic Z-inspired blend. And it flies just like a Zone, one of the most popular approach discs on the market. And it's popular for a reason, because it has reliable overstability, and now even a little less glide thanks to that spoiler on top. But one thing that the Vessel, Pig, Neon, Stego, Berg, and Range all have in common is that they are all essentially considered approach discs. Which begs the question, why haven't surface technologies made their way to drivers? Perhaps the new Streamline Turbulence can help answer that question. Rated at 7203.5, the Turbulence has a very low profile. It's shallow, but because of the recessed flight plate, it feels maybe a little deeper than it really is. The question I have is whether it can compete with a traditional 7-speed overstable fairway driver. To find out, Josh is putting it head-to-head against my overstable 7-speed, the Discmania Color Glow FD1. The FD1 is rated at 7502, but in this plastic it's stiff, flat, and very overstable. I use it in my bag as a slower Firebird or Raptor type disc for shots that I need to get overstable in a hurry. And off the tee, the FD1 shows that overstability well, resisting turn and fading aggressively. But not as aggressively as the Turbulence, which gets a bigger swing to the left on the same angle as the FD1, and didn't quite fly as far either. On forehand, the Turbulence shows us it can fight out in a hurry. Josh throws it a bit low on Anheuser, but it quickly fights back to flat and fades out. Based on these flights alone, the Turbulence is worth a look. But there's another reason that you might want to consider trying one for yourself: the price. MVP's overmold prices have always been competitive with the rest of the disc golf market, and they maintain that solo mold discs are cheaper and easier to make, and therefore they sell them for quite a bit less than other companies. For example, Discraft's ESP plastic has a manufacturer-suggested retail price around $22, and Z plastic is around $18, while Streamline's premium opaque neutron plastic retails for just $14. Even the special edition Turbulence that they're releasing alongside this stock one on July 11th, the day after this video comes out, is just $18. But it's not all rainbows and butterflies for the Turbulence. When you hand someone a disc like the Berg, they either love it or hate it. And I believe the same will hold true for the Turbulence. You will either love the feel in your hand, or it's going to feel too weird, too unconventional, or in all likelihood, too shallow. Either way, if you're interested in trying one for yourself, you can get one on or after July 11th at sixsidediscs.com or at the link in the video description. Any purchase you make directly supports the content we create. And remember, channel members can get 5, 10, or 20% off their order, so consider becoming a member today by clicking the join button below this video. What's your favorite thumb track style disc? Leave a comment down below. And also comment below what innovations in surface technology you think we'll see in the future. Special thanks to Gateway Disc Sports' Dave McCormick for helping us with research on today's video. For Six-Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. What do you think is the most underused slot in a professional disc golfer's bag? I'll give you a hint. It's one of the most popular in an amateur's bag. That's right, it's the Understable putter. The slowest, sometimes flippiest, and all-around most beginner-friendly discs around. But just how different are they, and which one would work best for you? To find out, we have 30 neutral to understable putters to find out just how understable they are. Or aren't. Because flight numbers don't matter. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six-Sided Discs, and let's talk about what an understable putter should be. Regardless of flight numbers, understable putters should be easy to turn, like this. If you throw it on hyzer, you should be able to get some hyzer flip straight shots like this one. And ideally, you can adjust your angles and speed to get something in between, like this. And all three of these shots were made with the same mold, in 3 different plastics. It's none other than the Axiom Proxy. The Proxy is one of the best understable putters on the market, consistently a top seller for us here at Six-Sided Discs. It's a disc that I've even bagged in multiple plastics over the years. But it's also a disc that top professionals like Simon Lizotte can use for straight to slowly drifting shots. So if we know the Proxy is so good, why are we exploring 27 other understable putters? Well, it's because understable putters are actually a little bit hard to find. What isn't hard to find is our new Flight Numbers Don't Matter patches, which may be coming to a city near you. That's right, this summer Six-Sided Discs is on tour, and you can find us at the Ledgestone Fly Marts, both Friday and Saturday night, all 3 days at Idlewild, the Saturday Fly Mart at D-Glow, and all 4 days of the Tour Championship in Lynchburg, Virginia. Ledgestone is only a week away, so we look forward to seeing you out in Illinois. At each stop, we'll be giving away our brand new Flight Numbers Don't Matter patches to subscribers, so make sure you stop by, say hello, and show us you're subscribed to our channel to get your patch. Quantities are limited for each event, and these patches will not be on sale until early next year, so get yours while you can. Alright, back to the understable putters, and while preparing for this video, I actually found it kind of difficult to find understable putters, at least by flight numbers alone. There are quite a few companies that make as few as 1, or in some cases, 0 putters with understable flight numbers, meaning they say they have more turn than fade. And there were others that, as is often the case with these videos, I just couldn't get a hold of in time to make this video. I think part of the reason for this is there's a lot of companies that give their slightly understable putters flight numbers like 0 turn and 0 fade, or -1 turn and 1 fade. And that's tough, because as we're about to find out, some flight numbers aren't super accurate. For example, let me start by showing you a truly neutral disc, the Luftdisc's Hydrogen. We tested out the Hydrogen and the rest of the Luft lineup about 1.5 years ago. And the Hydrogen really surprised me because it's one of the only discs we've ever found that truly wants to stay on whatever angle you put it on. Hyzer releases want to stay on hyzer. Flat releases want to push straight and stay flat. And anhyzer releases slowly hold that angle and drift. Most discs don't do that, but some do, like the Innova Dart. The Dart is one of those discs that just likes to hold the angle that it's on. Rated at 3400, the Innova Dart has a narrow rim with a deep, domey shape that loves to float and give a neutral flight. But let's compare that to another disc with 0 turn and 0 fade, the Discmania P1. Rated at 2300, the P1 is the most neutral complement to Discmania's flagship putter, the P2. Or is it? Because on nearly every throw, we found the new P-Line P1 to be surprisingly overstable. And it won't be the only one, because we have quite a few 0-0 or -1-1 discs that we're going to test today. But first, let's get an idea for what we're actually looking for by seeing a few putters that were actually understable. The latest disc in the Infinite Discs lineup is a great example of a truly understable putter. This is the Artifact. Rated at 2.3 -1.0, it's here today in sea blend plastic, and it's a deep putter. And while the shape and feel may not immediately be appealing, the flight very much was. The artifact was quick to turn, so quick that it gave me an idea. So I asked Josh to back off on the power slightly and give it some hyzer, and wouldn't you know it, the artifact can deliver super straight shots that flip up from hyzer just as well as it can do those quick and easy turnovers. So let's pause here for a moment and see how these discs are all going to stack up against each other on our chart. If the Lufthydrogen represents a truly neutral disc, it should occupy the dead center of our scale here. And we're not expecting much to be overstable today, so we're going to leave a little more room on the understable side of our graph. The dart is very close to the hydrogen, but the P1's neutral rating flatters to deceive, and was in fact much more overstable, while the artifact was comfortably understable, probably more so than the -1 turn suggests. And for good measure, let's go ahead and add those 3 proxies as well. So let's begin our comparison by taking a look at some discs that have these neutral 0.0 or -1.1 flight ratings and see if they really are. And we'll begin with the Climo Disc Golf Champ. The Champ is the first putter in Climo's line, rated at 2.300. We've been loving the new Climo line. I personally bagged the Osprey, and will be putting their all-new fairway driver, the Streak, to the test in the next 2 weeks. But the Champ is not quite what it says. On the putting green, it's very neutral, no worries there. But off the tee, it has been consistently a bit more overstable than the 0.0 numbers suggest. If it were me, I'd give it something like a 0.1, but then again, flight numbers don't matter. Another brand we've been a fan of here is Divergent Discs, but for very different reasons. On the one hand, discs like the Narwhal, which we'll see later, have been great. I personally bag one for Understable forehand shots, and I love it. But on the other hand, they have produced some pretty crazy moments on our channel, like the Capre in our Understable mid-range test. Whee! Or their rubber discs, the Golem and Alpes, which have both shown us the pros and cons of rubber discs. But one disc that we've not yet tested is this, the Nuno. Rated at 3.4 -1.1, the Nuno is a funky design. It's domey and it has a tiny bottom mold compared to the top. And while most divergent discs we've thrown are more understable than we expect, the Nuno is not. As you can see here, the Nuno caught us by surprise to fly way more overstable than expected, landing right about here on our chart. Let's move on to something a little bit sweeter, like this, the Candy from Clash Discs. Rated at 3.3 -1.1, the Candy is smooth, deep, and it reminds me a lot of the Discraft Luna, both in shape and in feel. But will it have any similarity in flight? Well, yes and no. Considering the Luna is supposed to be overstable, the Candy actually flies quite a bit like the Luna. And while the Candy's flight numbers of 3.3 -1.1 are pretty close to accurate, the Luna's are not. Even after Discraft recently updated the flight numbers from 3.303 to 3.402, it's still just not that overstable. But hey, that's not what we're here to talk about today. We are here to talk about understability and put the Candy right here on our chart and move on to another supposedly straight disc, the Supersonic Discs Momentum. Rated with some impressive glide at 3.700, the Momentum is another smooth, rounded putter from Danish manufacturer Supersonic Discs. We took a look at Supersonic in our first impression series, and we were really impressed with just how different and unique their disc design is. And while some flight numbers seem to make claims that discs just can't quite back up, the Momentum really doesn't want to stop flying. Here you can see it flip up, drift, and just keep floating and floating and floating. Unfortunately for the Momentum, we are analyzing stability as much as we're talking about glide, and the Momentum is definitely more understable than 0.0, putting it right about here on our chart. So far in this section of neutrally rated discs, we've had mostly discs that aren't really understable at all. And considering that's what we're looking for today, I was relieved when we finally got to the Innova Star Colt. Rated at 3.4, -1.1, the Star Colt is a beaded putter, and it's far from the most popular disc in Innova's lineup. In fact, it's probably one of their least thrown putters. But is it because it doesn't really fly straight at all? Maybe, because this Star Colt is crazy understable. In fact, the Colt is as understable as some of the most understable putters that we're going to see in just a few minutes, which puts it right about here. Just a few more neutrally rated discs remain, and one that was just a touch more understable than advertised was the Gateway Shore Grip Shaman. I've always loved the feel of the Shaman. There's something about it even as a putter that feels just right in my forehand grip. And of course it looks even better with our Disc is in the Details stamp, available now at sixsideddiscs.com. And honestly, it's pretty close to those flight numbers of 3.3, -1.1. Josh gets it to turn over and hold the gentlest of turns for a smooth drifting flight. Now the Shaman has been around for a long time. It was approved by the PDGA back in 2014. But neutrally flying discs weren't magically invented 11 years ago, because you can get one from way back in 1983. This is the Innova Aero. Rated at 3.600, the Aero is a little bit older than me, and it glides a lot farther than I would if you threw me. That's because it's domey as heck. In fact, the Aero is more like a slow mid-range than a putter, and in this Halo Star plastic, it's pretty wild because much like the Momentum, it just floats forever. Another fun party trick that's hard to see here because of the line that's tracing its flight is that it's drifting right for much of the second half of its flight, even though it's sort of on a hyzer angle the entire time. The Aero is definitely more understable than its flight numbers, but it's still a pretty cool disc. However, we end this neutrally rated section with a pair of disappointments, because one of DGA's new putters, the Surf, and Doomsday's Bleak in base and premium glow plastic respectively, were not only not understable, but they weren't even as straight as their -1 turn and 1 fade would suggest. Both were frustratingly overstable for their flight numbers, and land here and here on our chart. Pardon the interruption, because we're excited to announce that our new jerseys are finally here. This year we partnered with Cardinal Disc Golf to bring together a vibrant design with teal accents that really pop. Grab yours today at sixsideddiscs.com or at our upcoming pop-up shops. And remember, channel members can get 5, 10, or 20% off orders both online and in person. Click the join button below this video to learn more. Now, back to the putters. Okay, so the selection process today was a little frustrating, but from here on out, we are only looking at discs that are actually rated to be understable. That doesn't mean they will be, but at least someone thought they would. Anyways, let's begin with one of my all-time favorite understable putters, the RPM TUI. Rated at 3.4, -1, 0.5, the TUI is RPM's only understable putter. But when you do it right, you don't have to do it twice. And boy, did these Kiwis get it right. The TUI has a smooth but consistent turn that, combined with the narrow rim and average depth, makes it an ideal disc for players of all ages and skill levels. If you were to try one disc from RPM, this should be it. Next up is another all-rounder in the world of understable putters, the Discraft Fierce. And if there was anything in today's comparison that was a sure thing to me, it was probably the Fierce. Not because it's super understable, but because it's consistent and reliable, which is something that's kind of hard to come by for an understable disc. Rated at 3.4, -2.0, the Fierce, here in titanium plastic, shows us something that only the finest understable discs can. Late turn. It's one thing for a disc to quickly and aggressively turn over, but for a disc to be designed in such a way that it can turn late in its flight is rare and hard to find, because it opens up a shot that other discs simply cannot do. So, bravo Fierce, well done. Next up, let's take a look at a couple of rubber discs, the Elevation Koi and the Divergent discs, Alpes. We talked about some of the crazy moments we've seen from Divergent discs earlier. But let's not forget the epic double ace trace we had to do for a Koi that ripped in half. So this is a great time for me to remind you that if you're newer to our channel, we have a back catalog of over 100 videos exploring flight numbers, plastics, discs, and more. Today though, there are two things that I can state with 100% certainty about these two rubber discs. One is that they can and will do things that surprise you. And two, they are actually understable. In fact, for Josh, the Alpes and Koi were really understable. And with flight numbers of 44, -21, and 34, -10 respectively, they were quite a bit more understable than expected. Now, I think the main reason for that is not that they're actually much more understable than these other discs, but that rubber discs are just kind of tricky. And it's really, really easy to not get a clean release. After a couple shanks, I asked Josh to try some basic standstill approaches, something that these discs should actually excel at. And things improved slightly. The Alpes was still super understable, and it still caught edge when it hit the ground, which might not matter as much with a plastic disc, but that rubber's basically a tire, and it will just start running in whatever direction it hits. The Koi, though, showed what it's really good at: floaty, understable approaches. Unfortunately, neither were a fantastic understable putter off the tee. They finish right about here on our chart, and we'll move on to a disc that deserves an honorable mention, the Streamline Range. With flight numbers of 2, 1, -0.5, 0.5, the Range was MVP's attempt at a low glide, neutral approach disc, and it seems they got things just about perfectly right. From the slightest of hyzers, it gets very little turn and almost no glide to go virtually nowhere, which makes it quite unique compared to the rest of these glidey, understable putters that we're seeing today. And we'll move on to a disc that I doubt any of you have heard of, because honestly, I'd never heard of it either. This is the Mercury, from a brand called Inside the Circle. Hailing from Germany, they partnered with Gateway Disc Sports in Missouri for manufacturing. And the Mercury is their only approved disc, rated at 2.3, -10. And in this stiff silver plastic, the Mercury is, well, not very understable. In fact, every time we threw it, it was moderately overstable. From a trash disc to one made of trash. Okay, I don't like the trash analogy. Can we do like literally anything else? From inside the circle to inside the earth, it's the inner core. Okay, I'm not sure that was a great segue or analogy either, but regardless, this is the Trash Panda inner core. Rated at 2.4, -0.50, the inner core was Trash Panda's first mold, and is, like all Trash Panda discs, famously made from 100% recycled plastic. This one was made from recycled phone cases, so that's cool, which gives it this pretty pink color and metal flake appearance. The inner core gives us a nice, moderate, but smooth turn to show us that reliable understability that we're looking for. One of the best that we've tested so far today, the inner core lands right here. And we move on to our last category of discs that are rated to be actually quite very understable indeed. And we'll begin with another disc you've probably never heard of, the Ling from Yikun Discs. The Ling is a really interesting disc. It's shallow, it has this sharp angle on the bottom of the rim, but most notably has a raised design on the top that adds some extra grip. This is what's referred to as a surface technology. Most commonly associated with thumb tracks and groove tops, we covered this in a recent video in this series, which included the new Turbulence from Streamline and MVP, which we also now have in this sweet custom stamp available now at sixsideddiscs.com. Anyways, the Ling is rated at 2.3 -3.1, making it, by the numbers, one of the most understable discs that we'll be testing today. And by the flight, it was indeed just as understable as advertised. The Ling quickly turns over and keeps turning all the way to the ground. And in this base Tiger plastic, the Ling is one of the most beginner-friendly putters around, and available at a bargain price. Next up, let's see a disc that we know quite well, the Divergent discs, Narwhal. Rated at 3.3 -2 0.5, the Narwhal featured in a recent Disc is in the Details video with the Innova Dart. And I liked it so much, I stuck one in my bag. We have it in two plastics today. They're Max Grip, which is this bouncy, rubbery blend, and Max Value, which is a tacky but firm base blend. And much like we've seen before, the premium plastic has a little more stability. Here's the Max Grip on a super straight shot, while the base Narwhal has plenty of understability, easily turning over. The Narwhals land here, and much like the Ling, are excellent beginner-friendly understable putters at value prices. And with 5 discs left, we have some of the easiest turning discs around. But don't be fooled, because some of these are actually excellent for more experienced players as well. Up first is yet another brand we had never thrown, the Zeal from Uplay Disc Golf. Uplay is a certified 501c3 non-profit that specializes in promoting health and well-being through disc golf. Founded by longtime professional disc golfers Zoe Andyke and Dustin Keegan, Uplay provides on-site teaching and clinics for kids, something that my son Eli has done a couple times at Idlewild. They also provide professional development for PE teachers in school districts, and much more. The Zeal is a beginner-friendly, easy-to-throw putter for just $8 from Uplay, and it helps raise funds for their initiatives. Here in their Inspire Firm plastic, it is very firm indeed. And the Zeal lives up to that beginner-friendly label as Josh gets some effortless turn from it. While it's not the most understable disc that we tested, it had enough turn to land right about here on our chart. And that takes us to a pair of very understable discs from Innova, the Mirage, and the Wedge. Approved in 2016 and 2010 respectively, the Mirage and Wedge are two of Innova's most understable putters. Both have narrow rims, and the Mirage is very shallow. And both should be quite popular with players who prefer smaller discs. And they should also be quite popular with players who like effortless understability, because the Mirage and Wedge have plenty to go around. While the Mirage has the smooth turn that pushes out to about 275 feet or so, the Wedge was much more aggressive and only made it to about 180 feet, turning over quickly and sharply. But once again, that's what makes these excellent candidates for newer players to throw off the tee. And that takes us to our final two discs, which provide reliable understability to more advanced players. It's the Prodigy PA5 and the MVP Spin. Now, I say these are good for more advanced players because, as we'll see in a moment, they provide reliable understability without this sort of turn and burn and cut roll action that we saw from the Wedge. The Prodigy PA5, rated at 3.4 -2 0.5, has a smooth rounded rim, but also a beaded feel to the underside of the rim. Quite the contrast to the MVP Spin, which has a big rounded top and a tiny bottom that cuts in sharply with no bead. But despite the clear difference in design, the PA5 and the Spin can show relatively similar flight characteristics. They both provide easy turn and glide, which enables controllable shot shaping. And they may not be the most understable that we tested, but they are probably the most usable for the most players. So they land here and here on our chart, and that leaves us with quite the spread to process. From discs with neutral to understable flight numbers, we've ended up with them all over the place. But a few of them do stand out. The Proxy, as our example from the start, is probably in that mildly understable category, alongside discs like the Inner Core Shaman, or Tui. The very understable batch we looked at last all performed much closer to expectations. While discs like the Fierce and Range show that some understable discs are specialists in this category, providing late turn or less glide to unlock shots that other discs just can't do. But one thing that you don't usually hear us say in our videos is which one was our favorite, which one would we recommend? And there's a reason for that. As we have shown several times in other videos, players of different skill levels and arm speeds get very different results from the same disc. Which means no matter which one we like best, we can't really say which one would work best for you. So we'll continue to not pick our favorites or make recommendations because only you know how you throw, and only you know which one of these might work well for you. Which understable putter is your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. And also comment below what future tests or comparisons you'd like to see here on Flight Numbers Don't Matter. Lastly, remember that you can get your own Flight Numbers Don't Matter patch for your bag or cart at several upcoming Disc Golf Pro Tour stops, including Ledgestone, Idlewild, D-Glow, and the Pro Tour Championship. Stop by our tent and show us that you're subscribed to get yours. For Six Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. This is what most people call an overstable distance driver, the Innova Halo Destroyer. And they use words like reliable, dependable, or even beefcake to describe it. But it's not overstable. Not at all. Not compared to this.
Oh my God.
Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs, and this is Flight Numbers Don't Matter, and that was the Doomsday Apocalypse, which is just one of 45, yes, you heard that right, 45 distance drivers that we'll be comparing today. So many that they don't even all fit in this bin, and so many that this makes this the single largest comparison that we have ever done. The Apocalypse is probably one of, if not the most overstable distance driver ever made. It's super fast, completely flat, and it gets so much fade that it lands vertical and bounces, not to be confused with rolls, because it's definitely not rolling. The spin is actually spinning backwards when it hits the ground. And there aren't really any discs that can rival the Apocalypse, except for one that perhaps paved the way for it in the first place, the Discmania Tilt. A bizarre experiment in just how overstable a disc can be, Discmania and Simon Lizotte delivered this insane 9-speed, rated with 1 glide, 1 turn, and 6 fade. Coincidentally, the same glide, turn, and fade ratings as the Apocalypse. Though the Apocalypse is a 13-speed distance driver. The Tilt arrived way back in February of 2021, while the Apocalypse came a couple years later. But it's safe to say that neither of these discs are particularly useful for anything beyond very specific utility shots. And while the Innova Halo Destroyer is overstable, there is quite a big difference in stability between a Halo Destroyer and the Tilt or Apocalypse. Well, here's the thing. I've wanted to do this video for a long time, but one of the reasons we never did it until now is we sort of expected most of these discs to look exactly the same, and that we might struggle to see much of a difference. I mean, just look at the thumbnails of a few of these throws at a quick glance. There's really not much difference between them. But thankfully, if Josh throws hard enough and we look close enough, we just might pick up on those subtle differences. Now, when we do these really big comparisons, like our last one about understable putters, we like to plot them on a graph. It gives us a nice visual representation of how different they are. But in this case, we know they're not going to be understable. In fact, we're pretty certain they're all going to be very overstable. So instead of utilizing a graph, we are going to use something that the old research and development team here at Six Sided Discs has cooked up, the Six Sided Discs Beefiness Scale. In the culinary world, people have strong opinions about beef, specifically steak. But most people that like a really beefy flavor like to eat medium rare or rare steaks. A rare steak is seared on the outside at about 75% red inside, and this is considered by many steak lovers to be the perfect steak. Some people who definitely take that too far will go for an extra rare steak, or what's called a blue steak. seared on the outside, completely red on the inside. The meat on the inside still has a gel-like texture. Gross. And it's difficult to chew. And then if you're really a beef lover, you can just go straight up raw and have some beef tartare. On the flip side, beef lovers would say a well-done steak is basically ruined. And everyone can agree that one left on the grill long enough to look like this is literally garbage. And thus, we have our scale. The more beefy the disc, the more beefy rare flavor it gets on our scale. While any supposedly overstable high-speed distance driver that we test today that turns at all is a ruined, overcooked steak. Are we taking the beef analogy too far? Probably. Are we ready to start comparing? Definitely. And will Josh be throwing these as hard as he can? Undoubtedly. So let's begin with a disc from each category to establish some of the differences that we're actually going to be seeing and start filling things out. Oh, and I should mention real quick the selection criteria for this video. Discs over 10 speed with at least 3 fade and no more than 1 turn. So let's start with something nice and beefy, the Latitude 64 Stiletto. Rated at 1330.55, it is, according to the flight numbers, one of the most overstable discs that we'll be testing. And today we have it in Opto Chameleon plastic, which is typically a pretty overstable blend of plastic. So it certainly sounds like a recipe for an aggressive fade. And the Stiletto shows us an aggressive fade that starts almost immediately and continues until it finds some earth. And that's something that I'm going to have to figure out how to say in a lot of different ways today. So the Stiletto makes it all the way over here in our extra rare blue steak category, but somehow it isn't even close to the most overstable disc that we tested today. That being said, though, there were quite a few that were nowhere near as overstable as the Stiletto. For example, on the other side of the spectrum, also from the Trilogy family, is this, the Dynamic Discs Defender. Rated at 13.503, the Defender has a chunky feel in the hand, which isn't saying much because most of these 13 and 14 speed discs feel enormous. But the Defender is also a little bit deeper than some of those discs as well. And while the Defender is still plenty overstable, it just takes a little longer to do it, which drops it down 2 levels to medium rare when compared to the Stiletto. And why not complete the Trilogy family with the Westside Catapult, which will show us what a medium well disc looks like. Here's the Catapult rated at 14.503, showing some turn. And in today's test, that is simply unacceptable. Only the beefiest of the beef is what we want. Now, you might expect that there aren't many discs that would turn more than the Catapult, considering again that everything we have today is rated with at least 3 fade, but alas, you'd be wrong. This is the Innova Firestorm. Rated at 14.4, -1, 3, the Firestorm actually doesn't feel quite as wide as the Defender, and I think it could work on my forehand or backhand grip. This one has a domey pop top, and it's max weight. So, super overstable, right? Well, again, in the context of today's discs, not really, because it gets a hint more turn than the Catapult, pushing right before finally finding that fade. And I guess that makes sense. It does actually say that it has -1 turn. But compared to everything else that we tested for this video today, the Firestorm is a ruined steak. Well done. But yes, only just well done. There were actually 2 discs in this comparison that would be a completely charred, inedible hunk of burnt meat. And it's another disc from the Trilogy family of brands, the Opto Hex Missalin. The Missalin is a discontinued disc with pretty wild flight numbers and an even wilder design. Rated at 15 speed, 3 glide, -0.5 turn, and 4.5 fade, it has this fine texture of hexagons, because duh. And then 2 spots on the top flight plate are a sort of regular smooth plastic feel for extra grip. The idea here with the Opto Hex line was to see if golf ball style dimples on a disc would reduce drag and increase distance. But much like Latitude 64's attempts at making overmold discs, it didn't seem to change the flight enough to continue making them, and the Hex line was discontinued not long after it was introduced. Off the tee, the Missalin gets quite a bit of turn. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that this is a used disc, and it's at least 6 years old because the hex line was discontinued in 2019. But either way, a disc with 4.5 fade that turns this much is not beefy enough for us today. Okay, so 5 categories in, 3 to go, and we're starting to pick up on these subtle differences, so let's fill out that first line. Fitting in our medium category is another disc with just a slightly different flight. This is the Prodigy D1. And if the Catapult got some turn before fading out, and the Defender didn't really get any turn but didn't fade that aggressively, the D1 fits perfectly in between. But the rest of the flight numbers seem questionable. 5 glide, 0 turn, 4 fade. And 4 fade should make a disc super overstable, right? But not so fast, because the D1 just pushes and pushes and pushes straight before finally finding that fade. And honestly, this probably makes the D1 a lot more useful. No, I'm in beef mode. Beef is what we want. And it's just pretty medium. So how about we get back to some truly beefy discs like this, the Castoplast Rask. You know it, you love it or hate it, because those are the only 2 options for this Franken disc with a second flight plate on the bottom, because not only is the Rask a bit polarizing for having such a unique feel in the hand, it's also polarizing because it's been a little inconsistent. Some Rasks are super understable, others are super overstable, like this. Or, where we would put it today, rare. Next up is one of our 10 speeds, the Kiwi from RPM Discs. Here today in Cosmic Plastic and rated with 4 glide, no turn and 3 fade, the Kiwi is a bit unassuming. The flight numbers on the Kiwi are similar to an Onyx, which isn't a crazy overstable disc, but there's a little bit more to the Kiwi than you might realize. And the hint is where it's from. The Kiwi hails from New Zealand, and to put it simply, the flight numbers of 10403 do not mean the same thing in New Zealand as they would here in the Midwest of the United States. Because if you've never watched disc golf coverage from New Zealand, you may not know that it's really windy. In fact, when the Tour Down Under was in New Zealand in January of 2025, which is the middle of their summer, the average wind speed was 13 miles per hour. And that might not sound like much, but if you compare that to here in Ohio, where it is pretty flat, our average wind speed in the middle of our summer in July was only 5.6 miles per hour. All that is to say that if it's that windy, you need some beefy discs. And the Kiwi is outrageous. Here it is going left, immediately, and only about 240 feet. The Kiwi is beef tartare if I've ever seen it. And now that all our ratings have a starting point, we can dive into the rest of our discs. And why not dive in and take a look at all the discs we have from one of the biggest brands in the game, Innova Champion Discs. In addition to the Firestorm we already put on the cutting board, we also took a brief look at the Halo Star Destroyer. And as we have also established, any disc that gets any turn is the wrong side of medium on our board, which puts the Halo Destroyer right here in medium well. But we have 3 other contenders from Innova that should perform a bit better. Let's kick things off with the fastest of the 3, the Innova Champion Ape. Rated at 13.504, the Ape feels great in my forehand grip and terrible in my backhand grip, which to me says it is a true 13 speed. This one is in Champion Plastic. It's a tad domey, but nothing crazy. But will it be anything crazy off the tee? Josh lets rip and the Ape goes and goes and goes. And there's definitely no sign of turn, but it also isn't fading immediately like some of the most overstable discs we've seen. So that's going to slot it right here in medium rare, very overstable, but still plenty of distance. Next up is the Innova Excalibur, a favorite disc of Nate Sexton and Garrett Gurthey, just to name 2. The Excalibur is rated at 12.504. Today we're throwing Double G's Tour Series Halo Star Excalibur, and well, it's pretty overstable, but only above average, or rare compared to today's selection. because as we're about to see, the ceiling is quite a lot higher. So we'll follow that up with what might be an early contender for most overstable disc. Maybe. We'll see. This is the Innova Max. Now, here's the thing. The Innova Max is technically out of production. Or is it, because they did do a tour series run for Kevin Jones? But also the word on the street is that Innova has been making the Max by another name, the Infinite Discs Slab. So we have that here as well. And it wouldn't be fair to compare the Max and the Slab without including the Millennium Discs version, the Sabot. Because as you can see, these are all the exact same disc. Now the Max has quite a reputation. Whenever I talk to Innova fans and the conversation shifts toward overstable discs, I'm always hearing about how crazy the Max is. But can it live up to those expectations? Or will the Sabot or Slab be even beefier? Can it live up to its 11305 flight numbers? Do we have another beef tartare on our hands? Well, first, let's see the Millennium Sabot in action. And, okay, yep, I would say it's safe to say it is very, very beefy. With such a quick and aggressive fade, the Sabot is going to get all the way up to blue on our board. However, Infinite Discs seems to know that something's different with their Slab, because the flight numbers of 11305 on the Max and 11405 on the Sabot switch to 12304 on the Slab. And it shows. Here you can see the Slab just hesitates. While the Sabot is already fading, the Slab keeps on pushing just a little bit farther before finally swinging back. And that just moment of hesitation drops it down to medium rare. So is the Max the original beef boy that spawned these two imitators, or have they added extra beef since it was discontinued? Well, it is the original beef boy indeed. The Max is at least as overstable as the Sabot, if not a tad more, and rightly earns a spot alongside the Sabot in the blue column. And that's it for Innova. A nice spread and stability between them, but there's plenty more where that came from. Next up, why don't we see some beefy discs from a few smaller brands? Beginning with Legacy Discs. Legacy fans, I see you in the comments, and I'm sorry it took so long to get another Legacy disc in one of our comparisons, but here is the Rampage. At 14 speed, 5 glide, -1 turn, and 4 fade, the Rampage is huge. Sometimes you wonder if the speed number really means anything, and other times you try to get a disc in your hand and it just won't fit. This thing is massive. But does massive equal overstable? Mostly. The Rampage seems to be rated with -1 turn for a reason, because it does hold a bit straighter than most of these really beefy discs. And that hesitation once again will land it in the medium rare section. Next up is a disc that I'll admit I knew nothing about before this video, the Prodiscus Empire. Hailing from Finland, Prodiscus have been around for a while. Their first disc was approved by the PDGA way back in 2010, but the Empire is much newer, from January of 2023 to be exact. And the Empire has a very smooth profile. It actually fits in my hand, both forehand and backhand, which is rare for a 13 speed. And with 5 glide, 0 turn, and 4 fade, it's another disc promising a whole lot of beef. But off the tee, that's quite a bit of turn and forward push for something that's supposed to be much more overstable. So the Empire doesn't quite turn enough to get charred on our board, but it's definitely well done. Next up, we have a pair of beefy discs from a state known for its beef and barbecue. It's Texas's own Lone Star Discs. Here we have the Seguin. Yep, Seguin, that's how you say it apparently. And also the Tombstone. The Seguin is rated at 13503, while the Tombstone is expected to be a tad more overstable at 13404. First up is the Seguin, and from a slide hyzer, it pushes briefly before fading out. Side by side with the Tombstone on the left here, see if you can spot the difference. I'll play the clip a couple times for you. Did you see it? Right here. the Seguin holds just a split second longer than the Tombstone. And with a very similar release angle and trajectory, that's about as definitive as we're going to get that the Tombstone, rated to be more overstable than the Seguin, actually is. Is it enough to put them in different columns? Not quite. Another smaller brand with a super beefy disc for us today is Clash Discs. This is the Pepper. Rated at 11.504, the Pepper feels huge for an 11 speed. I think that's due in no small part to the fact that it's just really deep, a lot deeper than most of these discs. And it's more overstable than most of the discs we've thrown today as well. Virtually no forward push whatsoever. It aggressively fades its way right into the blue column. Now, earlier we tested 3 discs that are literally the exact same mold in the Max, Sabot, and Slab. But what about 2 discs that are technically the same, but legally different? The Infinite Discs Conqueror and the Discmania PD2. A super quick history here to get you up to speed is that Discmania's Originals line used to be made by Innova, and after ending that partnership, Discmania reimagined all of their old molds and now manufactures their own discs. Meanwhile, Innova began a partnership with Infinite Discs and now makes this, the Conqueror, which is, at least at first glance, the same disc. What's different about them, though, is the plastic. Our PD2 today is in Discmania's stock S-line plastic, while we have a concrete Conqueror, or in other words, Innova's champion metal flake plastic. So just how different can they be if it's just the plastic that's different? Well, quite a bit, because the PD2 is very overstable, quickly and aggressively fading its way into the rare column. But the Conqueror is quite different. On a very similar angle, it pushes right, even getting just the slightest turn. And no matter how much fade it has after that turn, you know that means it's on the wrong side of medium on our board. Continuing with Discmania's family of beef, the PD3. Straight from Josh's bag, the PD3 looks exactly like the Slab, Max, and Sabot. After all, this is an Innova-made PD3, and therefore, unsurprisingly, it is very overstable. Nothing too crazy though, rare as far as our board is concerned, because this one's a little bit used and ever so slightly beat in. Earlier we saw the D1 from Prodigy, so let's take a look at a couple more. Starting with the D Model OS. Part of Prodigy's Ace line, the D Model OS actually looks and feels eerily similar to the D1. And it flies eerily similarly as well, pushing and pushing straight for a really long time, just like the D1 did. So that puts the D Model OS right below the D1, and we move on to our next Prodigy distance driver, the X2. And something is in that Prodigy water, because I'll be darned if the X2, rated at 13.404, doesn't have basically the exact same stability as the D1 and D Model OS. It just pushes straight a bit longer than I would expect for what is supposed to be a super overstable disc. The X2 lands in medium as well, and we move on to our last Prodigy disc with a twist. This is the Prodigy Reverb. Rated at 13.503.5, it was released as one of Kevin Jones' signature discs before his departure and move to Innova. Then along came a surprise partnership we talked about in last week's video with Mint Discs. And the first disc in that partnership is this, the Idol. Rated at 13.5, -1.2.5, the Idol is another fast, overstable driver. And some people on the internet have said that they're the same disc, but if you look at them side by side, not so much. And if we look at them flying side by side, they're not quite the same either. The Idol lands here in medium rare, while the Reverb goes one level higher to rare. Next, let's move on to the MVP family, where they have some very fast, high-speed, overstable beef for us to choose from. Like this, the 14.5 speed Dimension. Rated with 5 glide, 0 turn, and 3 fade, the Dimension feels enormous. I'm not really finding a grip anywhere in here that feels like it fits my hand at all. So maybe it's not for me. Maybe it's for Josh to absolutely smash. And yeah, it's definitely more for him. It cruises out to a very overstable flight. Rare, at least. But can any other MVP distance drivers beat that showing? Well, I can tell you one that won't be is another 14.5 speed, the Axiom Delirium. With nearly the exact same flight numbers as the Dimension, the Delirium's similarities with the Dimension start and end with those numbers, because the Delirium was easily one of the least overstable discs that we tested, getting a huge turn before swinging back. Now again, is that bad? Not necessarily. But on our scale of beefiness, well done doesn't necessarily mean a job well done. Moving on, we have 3 13-speed drivers from the MVP family to look at, beginning with the Nitro. Rated at 13.4, negative 0.53, the Nitro is probably the only really high-speed disc from MVP that feels like it might fit in my hand. And for Josh, it was pretty darn overstable. Smacked out to the right here, it almost immediately begins to fight back, and it definitely deserves the rare column on our board. The 13-speed Panic from Axiom, with literally the exact same flight numbers as the Nitro, flew almost exactly the same. It fights out very quickly, fades aggressively, and also takes a spot under rare. But MVP is not done, because if you thought the Dimension was as overstable as it can get for MVP, you were wrong. This is the Energy. Rated at 13.404, the profile is wild. It feels huge, and it flies, well, okay, it doesn't really fly at all, because instead of flying, it just drops out of the sky. The Energy is definitely the most overstable disc from MVP, and very possibly one of the 3 most overstable discs we tested today. Beef tartare, no question. Next up, we move back to Trilogy, starting with my personal favorite distance driver, the Rive. Rive, which I learned recently means to split apart or tear violently, intense, is Latitude's flagship big arm distance driver, rated at 13.5, negative 0.53. And I've thrown the Rive as my go-to forehand distance driver for well over a year now, and I love it. I rip it on a slight anhyzer, and it holds that angle long enough for pretty decent distance before it fights back. And based on that flight today, that would make it one of the most understable discs in this entire lineup. But we're not testing my grand Rive, or even a brand new one. We're looking at Latitude 64's latest R&D project, Project Grip. Latitude 64 says Project Grip combines 2 premium plastics to create a unique blend that delivers an exceptionally grippy surface while maintaining a stiff, torque-resistant core. What also seems to come along with that is quite a bit more overstability. And what it means for Josh, compared to all these other discs, is that it's just, like, pretty overstable. No turn, but not super beefy either. Medium rare at best. Which is probably good, considering people throw it as like a normal distance driver. Speaking of actual, normal, usable distance drivers, let's take a look at the Latitude 64 Ballista Pro. Rated at 14.403 and a favorite of Estonian distance bomber Albert Bazooka Tom, the Ballista Pro is a super high-speed, very wide-rimmed disc for people with just big ol' hands, just mega mittens. Man, oh man, I cannot possibly throw this thing. Also, here's a great opportunity for me to remind you that there is absolutely no way that I could throw 45, 14, 13 speed drivers even once. So huge shout out to Josh, who's really putting in the work for us today. We appreciate your arm's sacrifice. Okay, back to the Ballista Pro, and let's get this thing in the air. And oh yeah, that is actually a bit of turn. So it's definitely not the most overstable, but silver lining, this was the farthest throw of the entire day at 475 feet. An absolute smash. Moving on, let's take a look at one of two discontinued molds we're testing from Latitude 64. This is the Gladiator. Rated at 13.503.5. It actually feels really nice to my hand. It doesn't feel huge for a 13 speed. And of course, in Latitude's optoplastic, it has this nice mix of grip and stiffness. And nothing about the shape, feel, or flight seems to be why it was discontinued, because it flies a really nice, overstable flight. No turn, no big forward push, just nice, consistent stability. So, medium rare is the best that we can give it today. Another discontinued driver from Latitude 64 also gives us a similar result. This is the recoil, which I first learned about in Disc Golf Valley, which is probably not a good sign, I guess. Maybe that has something to do with it being discontinued. Either way, at 12.403, it gets a very similar flight to the Gladiator. So it's also medium rare. One disc remains for Latitude 64 to see if they have anything close to the Stiletto that we saw earlier. This is the Scythe. Rated at 12.304, the Scythe has a really aggressive profile, a sharply pointed wing. It's another one of these discs that just feels like way too big for my hand, but maybe that's telling us something because the Scythe was really overstable. It starts fading just a bit quicker than the Recoil or Gladiator, and then it fades much farther left. So for me, that bumps it up to rare on our board, though the Stiletto is still more overstable. And now for something completely different.
And now for something completely different.
Because if you've been reading the disc info in the bottom left, which you hopefully have, you've seen that nearly every disc that we've tested today has been 172 grams or heavier. But our next disc is going to help us answer the question, how much does weight affect overstability? To find out, we're going to throw this, the Westside VIP Air World, with super overstable flight numbers of 14.4, 1 turn, 4 fade. It's a super wide rim, very high speed distance driver that I would fully expect to be a total beefcake at max weight. But what about at just 157 grams? Well, it goes from presumed beef tartare to charred to a crisp. This was the only disc in this entire comparison to do a hyzer flip. And that lightweight world perfectly demonstrates how the loss in weight, particularly out on the edge of the wing, impacts stability. And that leaves us with just one trilogy disc remaining, the Dynamic Discs Raider. Have you ever picked up a disc and it just fits perfectly in your hand? The Raider is that disc for me. It feels so good in my forehand grip, but unfortunately, I just do not have the power to throw it. Luckily, Josh can handle the stability because he smacks this Raider out high, and it definitely takes a moment to get overstable, but when it does, it gets left. And that's going to drop it right into medium rare, by far our most populated category. And that leaves us with just 5 discs. And hopefully you're still with us. And hopefully you know that the first thing you learn about good television or YouTube is that you always save the best for last. And what would you say if I told you they were all made by the same company? I know, crazy, right? Let's ease ourselves in with this, the Discraft Machete. Here in Z Plastic, the Machete is rated at 11.404, and it's a super flat, aggressively overstable disc, right? Well, sort of, because for Josh, it's actually not fitting into that crazy overstable category. It's overstable, don't get me wrong, but it's not crazy, so it's just medium rare. Nothing more than that. The Nuke OS, though, is one of those overstable discs that just feels overstable. It is so wide, the rim is super stiff and chunky, and it just kind of blows my mind that people actually use this. You see Aaron Gossage throwing it out there on tour all the time, but for average power, or even Josh, who has definitely above average power, the Nuke OS is just stupidly overstable. You can see where the D1 pushes straight, or the Missilin got a touch of turn. The Nuke OS just doesn't hesitate for a second, and it is fading aggressively, barely getting out to like 300 feet. So the Nuke OS is right at home in our blue very rare category. But believe it or not, there were no less than 3 discs that were as overstable, and in fact, quite a bit more. 2 discs that are right on the line of being the same as the Nuke OS are going to be these, the DGA Proline Hypercane and the Discraft Z Flick. The Hypercane is essentially DGA's version of the Nuke OS, a thick, chunky 13-speed rim, which is usually combined with a very flat top for increased overstability. And it delivers. The Hypercane almost matches the stability of the Nuke OS exactly, and has just enough more than our rare category to jump over into blue. While the Flick is more of the same. The Flick says it's just a 12-speed, but somehow it feels even bigger in the hand. And it's somehow even flatter and stiffer than the extremely flat and stiff Nuke OS we tested. And wouldn't you know it, that's a recipe for doing only one thing. Going left, or your left, my left, left. Another gelatinous blue steak. I don't know how anyone could eat that, but I guess, you know, good for you if you like that. Which finally brings us to our last disc, which has perhaps the best name of them all. Say hello to the Hellfire. And well, how convenient is it that the beefiest disc we threw today has the coolest name, Hellfire. This Hellfire is wild. For a disc that wasn't designed as a total gimmick, to be this overstable is crazy. It deserves every bit of the 5 fade that it has, and maybe even a little bit more. So the next time you're heading out to play the glass blown open in a gale force wind, grab yourself a DGA Hellfire. You won't be disappointed. And that leaves us with this, our board. Oh, did I forget something? Yeah, you may have noticed I didn't put the Tilt or the Apocalypse on this board, and there's 2 reasons for that. The first is that the Tilt is not a distance driver, so it's not really part of this comparison. But the Doomsday Apocalypse is. But it just isn't even comparable to the rest of these discs. You can't call it beef, it's not rare or blue, it's not beef tartare. Honestly, it's so much more overstable than our beef tartare discs that it's still a cow. Or maybe it's some fancy dry-aged beef. I don't know, this beef analogy is falling apart. Suffice it to say, the Apocalypse is just out of this world. And if you want to see Josh actually try and get some real distance out of the Apocalypse or Tilt, stick around to the bloopers at the end of the video. But before we get to those bloopers, let's ask ourselves, what have we learned from today's test? Well, generally speaking, discs with 3 or more fade, above 10 speed, tend to be pretty darn overstable. We've also learned that most of these are probably completely unusable for like 99% of players. And we've also learned, or rather, I've learned, that 45 discs is probably too many for just one video. Because not only do they not fit in the bin, but I think I'm about to lose my voice from trying to talk about all of them. Which of these super beefy discs stood out to you? Do you bag any of them? Let us know in the comments below. And also comment below what tests or comparisons you'd like to see in the future on Flight Numbers Don't Matter. For 6-Sided Discs, I'm Greg, and I'm gonna go be a vegetarian now. We'll see you in the next one. Okay, I have a question for you. What's the point of making discs this light? What's the point of making a 112-gram Innova Aviar, or a 110-gram Gateway Sabre, or a 117-gram Discraft Buzz? These are the kind of questions that I've gotten from people when showing them ultralight discs. And it's a difficult question that we're going to try to answer today. And I think it's a question that people are at least somewhat curious about. Because one of the most viewed videos on our channel is a Flight Numbers Don't Matter video we did comparing lightweight discs to max weight discs with different throwers. But today we're going to take a slightly different approach. Because we have 6 different molds at super low and super high weights, as well as a couple in between. And we're going to test those with 4 throwers of varying skill levels to see if we can actually find a use for these ultralight discs. Hey everyone, it's Greg from 6-Sided Discs. This is Flight Numbers Don't Matter, and today we are testing 6 of the lightest discs we have ever thrown. And no, before you ask, we are not testing any dyno discs today. In fact, we are throwing discs from 3 of the oldest brands in the game: Innova, Discraft, and Gateway. And for some icing on the cake, stick around to the bloopers at the end of the video where we're going to try out a 109 gram 6-sided disc. But what exactly is an ultralight disc, you might be asking? Well, allow me to circle back to dyno discs as an example, because we tested dyno discs at different skill levels almost exactly 2 years ago in November of 2023. Dyno discs are ultralight discs designed for kids. They aren't PDJ approved, though they are made from PDJ approved molds from ABC discs. Dyno discs tend to weigh around the 120 gram mark. They also tend to be incredibly understable. For example, here's Caleb throwing a distance driver a while back, and it's so understable, it does a barrel roll. And as I said before, dyno discs are ideal for kids. According to their own marketing, they are best for kids that have a maximum distance of around 200 feet. But dyno discs aren't the only ultralight discs in the game anymore, because recently, Discraft began releasing popular molds in a new ultralight Jawbreaker light blend. The Challenger, Scorch, and Buzz are among 3 that we've gotten our hands on recently, and right out of the gate, they feel quite different. Obviously, they're super lightweight, weighing between 110 and 120 grams, but the plastic is also very tacky and grippy, a characteristic that we will definitely be talking about more later. They feel great though, and I can certainly understand the appeal. You play disc golf, you throw Discraft, you want to get your kids into it, so you hand them a Buzz. Makes perfect sense. But again, who are these ultralight discs really for? Everyone's saying kids, but I want to try some out for myself. In fact, to really try and figure out what these ultralight discs are all about, we're going to test them with 4 different throwers. From myself, a 38-year-old MA2, MA3 player, to my wife, a very casual player, my son Eli, who's 10 and only recently started playing more regularly, and we'll even be testing these ultralight discs with probably the exact target audience, the highest rated FJ6 player in the world, who is also the youngest ever winner at an A tier, Sophie Elenko. Sophie took down the FJ6 division at the Music City Open in April of 2025 at just 5 years old. And to put this into perspective, just to be able to play a full 18 holes 3 days in a row is already an accomplishment in my opinion, given the attention span that kids have these days. Lucky for us, Sophie has already tested some of these ultralight discs that we're going to be throwing today on her family's YouTube channel, Daddy Daughter Disc Golf. So a huge shout out to Sophie, her dad Tim, and the rest of the family for helping us out with this video. Make sure you check out their channel at the link in the video description. But before we find out how these ultralight discs work for the highest rated FJ6 player in the world, let's test them out ourselves. And we do have some specific criteria by which we're going to judge these ultralight discs today. First, I want to know how easy are these ultralight discs to throw? How far do they fly compared to heavier discs? How different is their stability to those heavier discs? And finally, how are they affected by the wind? And we'll begin with the Discraft Scorch. We have 3 Scorches to compare today, a 115 gram Jawbreaker Light Scorch that again has that sticky, tacky feel to the plastic. We'll be comparing that to what most players would consider a traditionally lightweight disc, a 159 gram Z-Light Scorch. And finally, we have a nearly max weight, 172 gram Fused Scorch. And for me, the difference between these discs was, unsurprisingly, obvious to see. For my arm, the Fused Scorch is pretty overstable on both backhand and on forehand. While the Z-Light Scorch did actually show some turn and fade. The Jawbreaker Light Scorch, however, was outrageously understable. It got a huge turn on my backhand, and then flipped over so fast it went straight into a roller less than 100 feet off the tee on forehand. So for me at least, the Z-Light Scorch flew by far the farthest. Emily saw similar overstability from the Fused Scorch, but she actually got a little bit of turn from the Z-Light. And once again, saw a huge turn from the Jawbreaker Light. Though, to be fair, she did rip it over on a bit of Anheuser. And that also means that her best distance was with the 159 gram Z-Light Scorch. For Eli's arm speed, though, we start to see a shift towards the Ultralight having just that right combination of stability and distance. The Fuse Scorch and Z-Light Scorch are both pretty overstable for him, quickly fading out. And while the Jawbreaker Light doesn't turn, it does push quite a bit farther forward and at least 70 feet beyond these two heavier Scorches. And if we ended the test here, we might conclude that, wow, ultralight discs are incredible and they fly so much farther. But no, we want a bigger sample size. We have 5 more molds to test, and I think we might be able to draw some other conclusions by the time we're done. So let's move down in speed to the Discraft Buzz. And we also have 3 buzzes to compare today. A 117 gram Jawbreaker Light Buzz, which is looking pretty nice in this purple if I do say so myself. We also have another traditionally lightweight buzz in Z-Light, weighing in at 160 grams. And finally, a 174 gram ESP Buzz. And for me, the ESP Buzz was surprisingly overstable. It is gently fading for almost its entire flight. The Z-Light Buzz also had some decent stability. It flips up to flat briefly, and then gets a similar gentle fade. And notably, those 2 buzzes had almost the exact same distance, about 5 feet between them. And incredibly, the Jawbreaker Light Buzz was more of the same. On a bit of a hyzer flip, it also resisted turning over. It pushes forward and fades to nearly the exact same distance as the 2 heavier buzzes. But there's a little more to the story, because this also happened on another throw with the Jawbreaker Light. More on that in just a second, because Emily also found the ESP Buzz to be pretty overstable. On a much lower line, the Z-Light did turn just a little bit, but this time the Ultralight was indeed much more understable. On a similar line to the Z-Light, it turned quite a bit more. And you remember that janky shot I had with the Jawbreaker Buzz just a moment ago? Well, Emily found out just how hard it is to get a tacky, sticky, super lightweight disc to release from your hand.
I almost hurt myself laughing. Oh my gosh.
It just went that way.
Mommy almost hit the car.
And this will definitely become a trend amongst the ultralight discs, so stay tuned for more crazy misreleases. Anyway, for Eli, the Buzz was not nearly as conclusive as the Scorch. The ESP Buzz was still pretty overstable, and the Z-Light Buzz was as well. And the Jawbreaker Light initially looks to be flying much farther, but somehow only ends up about 10 feet away from the ESP Buzz. So if the Ultralight Scorch was a convincingly farther flyer, the Buzz was hardly convincing at all. So let's check out our final Discraft disc, the Challenger. Our 2 Challengers are both on the lighter side here. A 165 gram Jawbreaker Challenger and a 119 gram Jawbreaker Light Challenger. And this is where things start to get silly. Because while I threw one of my best shots in a while with the 165 gram Challenger, a dead straight shot with a very minimal fade, I could not get a clean release with the Jawbreaker Light Challenger. Here's shank number 1. And a bit of grip lock number 2. And lastly, I thought if I slowed it way down, maybe I would get a decent release. Nope, not happening. Emily had a similar experience, with the heavier Challenger getting a nice smooth flight, but the Ultralight doing the exact opposite. But as we saw with the Scorch and the Buzz, Eli didn't really have the same trouble that we had, as he got a pretty clean release and flight from both Challengers. And that means so far the ultralight discs are really performing and excelling for their target audience, which is ironic because Eli just recently took all of his old dyno discs out of his bag. Anyways, we arrive now at the 3 discs that Sophie did get to throw, and we'll see how the 4 of us handle the light and heavy versions of the Gateway Saber, the Innova Rock, and the Innova Aviar in just a sec. But first, a quick reminder. that if you enjoy the content we create, you can support us as a channel member by making your next disc or apparel purchase from our website at sixsidediscs.com, or by tuning into one of our Whatnot live streams where we're chatting with fans and selling lightly used discs from our videos. Oh, and I should also mention we're having a Black Friday sale the whole week of Thanksgiving, so check our website for that. Now, back to the Ultralights. Now, we're all going to be throwing the same 109-gram Innova AVR, 110-gram Gateway Saber, and 112-gram Innova Rock. And while myself, Emily, and Eli will be throwing the same max weight versions, Sophie had her own heavy versions to test. Let's dive into our final 3 discs, and to mix things up, we're going to go player by player rather than disc by disc. And we'll begin with yours truly. And I gotta say, it was quite a mixed bag for me personally, because all 3 of these heavier versions flew great. Here's the Saber getting a slightly overstable flight, the DX Rock getting a nice smooth drift out to over 300 feet, and the Champion AVR showing its overstability. But the light versions for me were a nightmare. I could not get a clean release with the Saber. Here it is shooting high up into the air, doing something. The Light Rock was more of the same. On one throw, I just cranked it over, a bit of a grip lock. While on the next, I thought I would try to do like a little hyzer flip. But this slight right to left tailwind that we had just carried this 112-gram rock about 100 feet to the left. And the Light AVR was just as hard to throw as the Light Challenger. So I'll graciously retire from this test and stick with throwing anything over like 158 grams. Let's see if Emily had better luck than I did. The Saber has a very clear and obvious difference for her. The 170-gram Diamond Saber was moderately overstable, while the Ultralight was super understable. The Ultralight Saber did go about 10 feet farther forward, but also about 100 feet to the right. The 180-gram DX Rock was also a bit overstable, while the 112-gram Rock was very understable. But again, very similar distances. And according to Emily, the lightweight AVR was useless. So while there's a nice variety in stability here, the lack of increased distance and control really calls into question how useful these ultralight discs would be for Emily. But Eli seemed to have some luck with the Discraft Ultralights, so let's see how he fares with our remaining 3 discs. And Eli began by taking a crack at the Saber on forehand, and while the heavier Diamond Saber was mildly overstable, the Ultralight Saber was more like my earlier forehand with the Scorch, just screaming straight into the ground as it turned over. On backhand, he had a very similar experience. The 170-gram Saber shows its stability once more with a smooth, hyzering finish, while the Ultralight rolls right over. And it was a similar experience with the Rock and the AVR. The heavier disc was very overstable, and the Ultralight was really understable. And this once again leads me to believe that the ideal weight for a disc, at least for Eli's arm speed, is probably somewhere in between these two. But what about for the #1 FJ6 player in the world? This is Sophie, and Sophie has some scary good form for a 6-year-old. If I were an FPO player, I'd already be worried. Let's begin though with the Saber. Sophie rips her heavier Saber out to around 107 feet. And while the Light Saber gets a touch more glide and maybe a touch more turn, it only goes 10 feet farther. And if today is about trends, here's another one. Sophie's max weight Rock flew out to 92 feet, while the Ultralight Rock flew out to 98 feet despite the slight grip lock. And even though her lightweight AVR went almost straight up in the air, it still flew 2 feet farther than the heavy AVR at 81 and 79 feet, respectively. So earlier I mentioned some criteria that we would try and judge these ultralight discs on. So let's review those once more. The first, how easy these ultralights are to throw? Well, they aren't. Consistently inconsistent releases is pretty much all I can say. How far do they fly compared to heavier discs? At best, maybe 5 to 10% farther. But if you factor in the wind, vastly different stability, I think it's very difficult to rely on that extra distance. The third question, how different is their stability? Well, as I just mentioned, almost always very much more understable, which makes sense. There just isn't as much weight in the rim to create gyroscopic stability. And finally, how are they affected by the wind? Well, fortunately, we didn't have much of a headwind today, but the tailwind carrying the lightweight rock a full 100 feet left is a strong indicator that they will be heavily impacted by almost any wind. And our results once again lead me to ask a question I asked earlier. Who exactly are these ultralight discs for? Yes, 6-year-old Sophie is seeing a little bit more distance. And 10-year-old Eli is seeing some variety in stability, and maybe a tad more distance with the drivers. But at what cost? Because while Emily and I's difficulties were well documented, even Sophie had trouble getting clean releases with these discs. Here's a few of her attempts that we didn't see. And it's pretty clear the lightweight discs are extremely inconsistent. In Dyno Discs marketing, they say their ultralight discs are for players who throw less than 200 feet, but I'm personally feeling like that number is way off. I think based on our results, ultralights are probably only useful for very low arm speed players, and ideally players who have never thrown heavier discs. You see, a heavy disc is heavy enough to pull itself out of your hand as you throw it. But these lightweight discs, especially these like really sticky, tacky Discraft ones, are just impossible to get out of your hand cleanly. And that leads to many more shanks than clean releases. Have you thrown ultralight discs? How have they flown for you? Let us know in the comments below. Huge thanks to Sophie and her family for helping us out with today's video. Make sure you check out their channel, Daddy Daughter Disc Golf, to see if she can add to her 23 career PDGA wins. Also comment below what other tests and comparisons you'd like to see on Flight Numbers Don't Matter in the future. For Six-Sided Discs, I'm Greg, reminding you that sometimes weight matters more than flight numbers. We'll see you in the next one.